We know what Donald Trump wants. He wants unchecked power. The question in 13 days will be, what do the American people want? Thank you.
Kamala Harris on the steps of her Washington residence offering a stark warning, calling her rival increasingly unhinged and unstable. But will it move the needle? Many Americans have already made up their minds. In fact, millions have already cast their ballot, including Harris's running mate Tim Walz and his son. This election comes down to a handful of floating voters in just a handful of states, like Pennsylvania, a Baptist church where politics is preached.
The election for the President of the United States will be decided in Pennsylvania. And more specifically, it will be decided in Erie, Pennsylvania. And it will be determined by the margin that we are inspired, that we are hopeful, that we get up and go to work, and we stop complaining about what we don't have, and we use what we got.
Arizona, another battleground, another Democratic Party heavyweight. Immigration is a big voting issue here.
The record shows that Trump sent more fully documented immigrants home than undocumented immigrants. It's not about solving a problem, it's about keeping you torn up and upset, full of resentment and anger. And it's crazy.
But Donald Trump's hardline stance on immigration is resonating with many. He took his message to Georgia.
We made the border really good, and now we're going to have to do it again. The difference is this border is 10 times, 15 times worse than it was in 2016, as you know. But we're going to stop it, and we're going to deport all of these criminals that have been brought into the country.
Kamala Harris claims she's tougher than Trump when it comes to cracking down on illegal immigration, but she also has to make a pitch to immigrants.
How Latinos vote can help pave the pathway for the solutions. Donald Trump is not going to push for a pathway for citizenship. He did not in the past, he will not in the future. We know Donald Trump and how he talks about immigration.
Yeah.
And so I cannot emphasize more strongly. The Latino vote in this election is very important.
Every vote will be important, every vote pivotal in swing states. That's where this election will be won or lost. Benji Haya, Al Arabiya News, Washington.
You might see me every day after the election as well. If there is no clear outcome of this race for the White House, it's perfectly possible that counting could go on for several days in some key states, including Arizona, where Donald Trump finds himself today. In Maricopa County there, election officials are warning that it could take them 12 days to finish counting the votes in that particular battleground state. So we could be in for a very long night on election evening that stretches potentially several days into the future. I mean, I think what has become clear, Rosanna, over the last 24 hours is that the Harris campaign has decided that its closing argument is going to be, as she said last night in that CNN town hall meeting, that Donald Trump is a fascist, as she put it last night. She agreed with Anderson Cooper when he asked her if she thinks that Donald Trump is a fascist and a threat to democracy. So when Kamala Harris hosts a closing rally on the ellipse of the White House next Tuesday, that is going to be the message that she hammers home, that Americans will at that point have 1 week left to protect American democracy. And it's interesting that they have returned to that theme in the closing days of this campaign, because it's far from evident that most American voters view the future of America's democracy as one of their top 3 or 4 concerns in this election. I mean, it's clear that the economy, that immigration and that abortion trump protecting democracy in the minds of most voters from the polling that has been relentlessly done since this election campaign began. So very interesting that the Harris camp has decided to take that approach. It is a gamble, but it's one that they fervently hope is going to pay off, as several polls continue to show Kamala Harris with a very, very slight lead over Donald Trump nationally and in a handful of those all-important battleground states. Well, I think that what the Democrats are absolutely trying to do with this democracy argument is reach disaffected Republican voters, if you like, the Nikki Haley voters, people that are very uncomfortable voting for Donald Trump, even though Nikki Haley has, of course, endorsed him, but whose support the Democrats believe is in play. So they point to General John Kelly, the former White House Chief of Staff, General Mark Milley, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, both of whom have argued that Donald Trump, in the case of John the ads that appear on television. Focused on Pennsylvania, Georgia, and she's going to end the evening in Houston because
to be with you.
To France now, where the country's foreign minister, Jean-Noël Barrot, says an amount of $1 billion has been raised for humanitarian and military aid for Lebanon in a summit headed by Emmanuel Macron. The amount significantly exceeds both France's target of 500 million euros and the UN's initial request of 400 million euros for the conflict-ridden country. Earlier today, France's president committing a $108 million aid package for Lebanon as well at an international conference. This one, the same one, hosted by Emmanuel Macron.
In the immediate term, massive aid must be provided to the Lebanese population, whether it is for the hundreds of thousands of people displaced by the war or the communities that are hosting them. The United Nations has launched an appeal for 426 million euros. France will provide 100 million euros at this conference. What is needed is simply to shelter families, feed children, care for the wounded, and continue to provide schooling for children. Solutions must be found quickly, because we must, at all costs, prevent the displacement of people from the south, Beirut, and other regions of Lebanon.
Well, for more on this, I'm joined now from Paris by our correspondent there, Ross Cullen. Ross, good to see you. And tell us a bit more about this big summit. What's Macron really trying to achieve?
Yeah, good evening, Rosanna, from the French capital. It was early this morning that the French president opened the International Aid Conference. He's held one similar in the past for Sudan, trying to raise aid to support the Sudanese people still suffering from that civil war. So it was kind of the same format for what's going on in Lebanon at the moment, trying to raise financial support for the Lebanese people, hundreds of thousands of whom have had to flee their homes, have been displaced as a result of Israel's ongoing campaign against Hezbollah inside Lebanon. So it was an attempt to raise money, and he wanted to hit the United Nations goal, as you mentioned, of $426 million. Well, it was well exceeded that. Jean-Noël Barrot saying that it was around 800 million for humanitarian aid that was pledged and 200 million for support for Lebanon's security services. So around $1 billion in total. Of that, France said it would be pledging just over $100 million, and Germany followed suit with a figure just over $100 million. So there was a lot of success today in terms of what Emmanuel Macron was trying to achieve in fundraising for Lebanon.
Some strong words as well, and that's nothing new really from Macron towards Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. But what did we hear from him today?
Oh, they've just been, they've not been seeing eye to eye recently. There has been, they fell out over Israel's formation, which Emmanuel Macron put down to saying Israel was created through the United Nations. Also the fact that he has been voicing his very public disapproval of Israel's ongoing bombing campaign inside Lebanon. He's been calling for an immediate and lasting ceasefire in Gaza, an immediate and lasting ceasefire in Lebanon. So we are starting to see a firmer position taken by the French president when it comes to his position with the Israeli Prime Minister. France is not the key player in the region in terms of how much influence it has vis-à-vis the United States, but there are those connections, those historic connections between France and Lebanon. Why Emmanuel Macron feels that it is his kind of area, his field of influence, that he can hold this kind of international summit here in Paris.
There are indeed those big historic connections between Lebanon and France. So can I ask you, being based there in Paris, what has been the general sentiment in Paris and in France since the military conflict escalated in Lebanon?
Well, there's been an understanding that this is a conflict that many people would like to see ended in an instant before it even expanded, escalated into involving the Lebanese population. But there are some 20,000 French citizens who do live in Lebanon. There's a huge diaspora population here in France as well. So there is that feeling that when this started in October 2023, there was a lot of sympathy among the French people for what had happened in Israel, for the attack by Hamas inside Israel. Enormous Jewish population here in France as well. But then since the year, that year from October 2023 to now, October 2024, there has been that wave of sympathy that was there at the start has begun to fade because of the continuation of Israel's bombing campaign in both Gaza and Lebanon, which many French people do see as disproportionate.
Really interesting context. Thanks very much. Our Paris correspondent Ross Cullen. Now on to some news from Gaza. The Israeli army says it has arrested 200 people it calls militants in Jabalia since ramping up its military offensive there. Devastating images emerged from the enclave showing families fleeing the Jabalia refugee camp surrounded by rubble. Meanwhile, airstrikes and shelling are getting more intense, knocking hospitals out of service and blocking food and medicine from getting in, according to reports. The civil defence in northern Gaza has suspended its humanitarian services after the arrest of 5 personnel and the targeting of 3 others by Israeli forces. They reported that Israeli military vehicles struck their only fire truck with shells, igniting it. Additionally, 3 civil defence workers were injured by a missile from an Israeli drone in Beit Lahir following an evacuation order delivered by a quadcopter drone. Gaza Civil Defence Agency saying an Israeli strike on Al-Shahada school in Nusayrat camp, a school-turned-shelter, killed at least 17 people today in the Palestinian territory central Nusayrat area. The Israeli army claiming it had hit Hamas militants who were allegedly operating from the school. Well, let's get some of the other day's news now. And in the Philippines, Tropical Storm Trami has killed at least 26 people and forced more than 150,000 to flee their homes. Known locally as severe Tropical Storm Christine, it's dumped torrential rains on the main island of Luzon, triggering widespread flooding and landslides. The Civil Defence Office saying over 163,000 people are sheltering in evacuation centres. China's foreign ministry saying it was not aware of North Korean troops being in Russia. This after the US said it had seen evidence North Korea's sent up to 3,000 troops for possible deployment into Ukraine. Both Moscow and Pyongyang have denied the claims. China's foreign ministry spokesperson telling journalists that China's position on the conflict has been consistent and clear, with hopes for de-escalation. Police in Moldova saying a pro-Russian businessman channeled some $39 million to try to bribe voters in the country's recent presidential election. Ilan Shaw's accused of using a Russian bank for money transfers to try to influence around 130,000 voters against a pro-European stance. Shaw denies wrongdoing and the Kremlin has denied interfering. In Spain, police have raided a house as part of an operation to dismantle an international criminal group. The group, based in the provinces of Toledo and Madrid, are suspected of illegally trafficking migrants of Syrian and Algerian origin, accused of charging up to €10,000 for relocation, stay in Spain and transit to other European countries. Ukraine's foreign ministry saying Russia has failed to win support for its invasion of Ukraine at the 3-day BRICS summit in Kazan, where more than 30 world leaders gathered to participate in the conference. Now, this comes as Russian President Vladimir Putin faced direct calls to end the war and pressure from the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, as Megumi Lim reports.
Ukraine's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in a statement issued on Wednesday, said Moscow's attempts to impose its position on the war in Ukraine at the BRICS summit had failed. The statement referred to the final communique of the summit, saying that the vast majority of participants had expressed their commitment to peace and diplomacy and to the principles of the UN Charter. Now, throughout the conference, President Putin did face calls to end the conflict. Leaders like Chinese President Xi Jinping told the summit there must be no escalation of fighting in Ukraine. along with India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who also called for peace and said he supported dialogue and diplomacy, not war. Meanwhile, despite strong criticism from Kiev, UN Chief Antonio Guterres attended the summit and met with President Putin on the sidelines of the event on its final day on Thursday. It was the first time in over 2 years since Guterres and Putin met. The last time was when Guterres traveled to Moscow during the first weeks of Russia's full-scale invasion. Guterres also called for peace in Ukraine at the summit.
We need peace in Ukraine, a just peace in line with UN Charter, international law and General Assembly resolutions.
Although the UN Secretary General has repeatedly condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Kiev criticized his attendance at the BRICS summit, saying it was a, quote, wrong choice that does not advance the cause of peace and only damages the UN's reputation. Megumi Lim, Al Arabiya News, Kiev.
Well, let's bring you some of the latest sports news now. And coach Eddie Jones has promised his Japan team will challenge the All Blacks when the sides meet at Yokohama's International Stadium this weekend. The Brave Blossoms have never beaten New Zealand in 5 previous attempts. The return of Yoshitaka Yazaki as fullback is one of 5 changes to the starting lineup from the team. Fijian-born winger Jone Nakabula returns to start on the right wing. Harumichi Tatekawa will captain the side. Chinese top seed Zheng Xingwen beat Japan's Moyuka Uchijima in the last 16 at the Pan Pacific Open in Tokyo today. After a close first set, Zheng raced away in the second set to beat her Japanese opponent 7-5, 6-0. Zheng, the reigning Olympic gold medalist, had a slow start but regained her form in the second set. And Charlie Lind impressed at the International Series Thailand today, shooting 7 under par 63s to take the first round lead at Thai Country Club in Bangkok. This while China's Samson Zheng and Richard T. Lee from Canada fired 64s. This week's $2 million event is part of an exciting climax to the season on the Asian Tour. It's the 16th event of the year with 5 events remaining. Before we go, let's get a reminder of our top stories. With just 12 days until the US presidential election, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump trade personal blows as the polls remain tight. France's foreign minister says today's Lebanon aid conference has secured $1 billion in humanitarian and military assistance. And the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres calls for a just peace in Ukraine during a meeting with President Putin at the BRICS summit in Kazan. That is all we have time for. Coming up next is Hadley Gamble's interview with Yaroslav. And at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, join Tom Burgess-Watson for Global News Today. Goodbye.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deep fake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
my campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on The Rizkan Show for empowering conversation.
Yaroslav Trofimov, thank you so much for joining us. No Country for Love. This is your latest book, and a long line, quite frankly. You've had some prolific years. Walk me through how the idea for this book came to you.
Well, this is my first novel. So all the books I've written before were nonfiction books about Saudi Arabia, about Middle East, and about the war in Ukraine, this latest war that started in 2022. And I was living in Kabul when the conflict in Ukraine really began in 2014 with the first Russian invasion, when Crimea was taken, when really bloody conflict erupted in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine. 14,000 people were killed at the time. And I remember reading about it and watching the news and being flabbergasted with just how misunderstood Ukraine was, how little knowledge there was of Ukraine's history, its past, and how everything that was known about it was known through this Russian colonial lens, because Russia was the colonial master for centuries, and all the experts and many of the journalists, having lived in Moscow, just saw Ukraine through the prism of Moscow.
As an extension.
As an extension of Russia, and explained its history through the Russian history. And I think the idea of this book for me was I was so upset about it, and I remembered my own family stories, the family stories of so many other Ukrainians, and decided to write a book that is explaining Ukraine, explaining the tragic history of Ukraine that really is, the reason why Ukrainians are so resilient in fighting against Russia today. And to do it through the history of my family, my grandmother, and the tribulations that she went through, in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, which is really a period when Ukraine was probably the deadliest place on earth. Because the combination of the famine, artificial famine, orchestrated by Moscow that killed millions and millions of people in the 1930s, the execution of the Ukrainian intellectual class, World War II, the Holocaust, and the insurgency after that war, really, wrought havoc across Ukraine and destroying its best minds and a large share of its people.
Yeah. What I found interesting about this narrative, so much of it is based, right, on the life of your grandmother.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. It's obviously it's a work of fiction, but many of the key turns in this narrative are really, based on true stories that I heard from my grandmother, from my family. And, sometimes reality is stranger than fiction, and, some of the actually most stunning turns of events in the book are from real life. Yeah. And it's informed by a lot of research as well. So I started writing this book in 2014, and I finished writing it just before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began in 2022.
It's very interesting as well that your main character is a liberated woman, a new Soviet woman, if you will. And she sees the events of her life through that lens. She's not torn by religion in the same way that her parents were. She's not torn by social convention in the same way women in other democracies, for example, would have been torn. Yeah. She sees the events of her life as a liberated woman.
Right. Well, there was a lot of promise in the initial Soviet experiment. It was tragic, and it led to massive devastation and death. But there were some elements of it, like social liberation.
Which inevitably was rolled back.
Was rolled back as the regime became more and more conservative.
Yeah.
And so this book is also a story of dashed hopes, because it begins with the main character moving to Kharkiv, which then was the capital of Ukraine, to build a new life, to build the massive tractor plant, and to join the university, and find her husband. And then all of this gets crushed by this, mid-grandeur of history, as one of the characters says it, because tragedy after tragedy befalls upon her. And at the end of the day, it's a book about survival against all odds, about survival in this, circumstances that are very hard to imagine for us even now, today, even at the time when there is a horrible war going on in Ukraine. But things were so much worse back then. And the cost of that survival, the betrayals, the compromises one has to make for one's own sake, for the sake of one's children, to actually live through all of this. And is it worth it at the end? That is sort of the biggest question of the book.
Yeah. And even against the backdrop of sort of not just the history of Russia, but the history of Ukraine in relation to Russia, which is, as you say, the meat grinder of history, so much hope and promise, and a consistent, sadly, narrative of that rolling back, whether it be through armed conflict or through governments or political machinations. In your mind, where is Ukraine on that journey today?
Well, it's a very good question, and it really links back to the past, because people are all very often puzzled what is happening in Ukraine, despite all this death and destruction, and hundreds of thousands of people are killed or maimed, fighting against overwhelming odds. The Ukrainians keep fighting and keep sacrificing and not giving up now for 2.5 years. And I think the explanation for that lies in this past. That's in the fact that everyone like me has a family that lived through all these dark years in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, when just being Ukrainian was a crime. Speaking Ukrainian could be a crime. And there was a mass genocide during the artificial famine. And so, and these are the sort of policies that are now being praised in Russia again. The first thing the Russians do when they occupy a Ukrainian town, they destroy the monument to the victims of the first thing the Russians do when they occupy a Ukrainian town, they destroy the monument to the victims of the famine of the 1930s because they say it never happened.
Revisionist history.
Exactly. It's so on the part of Ukraine, it's sort of never again, but on the part of Russia, it never happened. Yeah. So it's not. It's a complete denial of the tragedies of the past, and I think that explains what the Ukrainians are fighting, because they know that the alternative to surrender would be so much more death.
Yes.
And so much more destruction, the way it happened back in the past.
Yes. How does generational trauma play into not just the book, but also the Ukrainians' fight today?
Well, I think generational trauma is the explanation for the resilience of the Ukrainian society and the Ukrainian military, because there is this knowledge back in the bones of everyone. Everyone has a grandmother, great-grandmother, who either was in the camps or who had family that died in a famine, terrible famine that had cannibalism and just things that are unthinkable now, or in the war. And so, or in the insurgency that was crushed in Western Ukraine in the 1940s, 1950s with inhuman means. Or the insurgency that was crushed in Western Ukraine in the 1940s, 1950s with really brutal ways. And so people know that if they don't fight, if they don't keep up the resistance, the price they will pay will be much higher than what they're paying today.
Yeah. How difficult was it for you to write from a woman's perspective?
Yeah, it's a tough one.
Because you have some insight.
Yes, well, I had good readers and good advice, I guess. But I did a lot of research, and I did actually speak to my grandmother before she passed away at the age of 96. So, the older one gets, the more, I guess, the franker one gets about one's youth. Yes. So I did a lot of research in Ukraine before the war. Going to libraries, to archives. So I tried to really create the narrative in a way that is most reflective of reality. It's obviously not a nonfiction book, but I had to be really accurate with the historical record and with the historical descriptions of the way things used to be.
Yeah. You also, in the last couple of years, have written another nonfiction book. And of course, that's about your experiences on the front lines of Ukraine at the beginning of the Russian invasion. Our enemies will vanish. When you look at that book and the body of work that you did at that time and where we are today, what in your mind is the main difference? Is it the international backing for Ukraine in terms of weapons? Is it the fact that the entire world rallied around the Ukrainian cause? Perhaps not the global South, but certainly in the West?
Well, actually, so Our Enemies Will Vanish really focuses on the first year of the full-scale invasion. And not that much has actually changed since then. If you look at the map of the conflict, here and there the Russians gained, the Ukrainians gained a little bit in the Kursk region of Russia, but overall, the overall front line hasn't really changed. So there's been a war of attrition going on since then. I think what has changed is the erosion of the Russian red lines. So things that were unthinkable back then, such as long-range Ukrainian strikes, all over Russia, hitting military airfields, oil refineries, Ukraine actually invading sovereign Russian territory. All of these all of these actions were thought of as, triggering nuclear war, completely unrealistic. And yet Ukraine showed that this can be done. And I think Ukraine is successfully, since then, redrawing the parameters of the conflict. It's not able to advance in the battlefield necessarily, but it's expanding the war into Russia. And it's creating costs for Russia that it has to reckon with.
Yeah, and that there's also, of course, been the cost for Ukraine and not just lives lost. In your mind, how close are we to an end to this conflict today?
It's hard to predict, but it doesn't look like it's going to end anytime soon, really. Russian government and President Putin and other senior members of the government have not given up on the initial aim of the invasion, which is to destroy Ukraine as a sovereign, independent country. And they still talk about Odessa and Kharkiv and Kiev as being Russian cities. And nothing indicates that they are ready to accept Ukraine as an independent state. And the Ukrainians, while suffering from the consequences of war, economic consequences, millions of people had to leave the country, hundreds of thousands were killed or maimed. However, they're not ready to sacrifice the land that is Ukrainian, and they're not ready to give up just yet. So I think we're in for months, years, possibly, of continuing warfare.
In your mind, does the U.S. presidential election have anything to do with that timeline? Because, of course, former U.S. President Donald Trump has signaled, he'd end the war the day he got in office, or at least try to. Kamala Harris has been much more measured, but there is a sense that she would at least work towards peace. In your mind, does that mean anything to those on the front lines?
Well, I think peace comes from a decision by one or both parties that they cannot achieve their objectives through war, and that requires one of the parties to be defeated, or at least to feel like they have more to lose from continuing than from stopping. And we're not at that stage yet. President Trump, former President Trump, has said he will bring peace to Ukraine in 24 hours. He hasn't said how. I'm sure Ukrainians would love to have peace in 24 hours. The question is at what cost?
Yeah, and politically, you don't see President Zelensky having any wiggle room when it comes to an agreement that would see him give up territory.
Possibly. I mean, it depends on how the conflict continues and depends on what level of casualties the Ukrainians sustain. But, he created new chips on the table. By occupying part of Russia, there is now part of Russia that can trade for Ukrainian territory. By having these long-range strikes into Russian territory, he can now trade that for Russia stopping attacking Ukraine with its missiles and long-range drones. Sorry.
I'll let you choke. Talk to me about the cabinet shakeup. President Zelensky, several months ago, changed up his defense minister, and then just recently his foreign minister as well. And his foreign minister was a gentleman, Dmitry Kuleba, who was well loved by many Western democratic leaders. Was this wise, in your mind, to change horses midstream?
Well, it's not the first shakeup that the Ukrainian government has since the war began. We've had the defense minister removed, we've had General Zaluzhny, the commander of Ukraine's armed forces, removed and sent to London.
Controversially.
Right, and sent to London to be ambassador of Ukraine to the United Kingdom. So the power really rests within Bankova, the headquarters of President Zelensky's administration. That's really where all the decisions are made right now. And he removed the foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba. He appointed to replace him Andriy Sybiha, who was the main foreign policy advisor to the presidency, former Ukrainian ambassador in Turkey and Poland. And then in another sort of important shakeup, the Minister of Strategic Industries, which means the Minister of the Military Industries, commission was moved to the presidency to be the president's advisor for strategic industries, which is actually a raise, a promotion. So at the end of the day, the only two people who make sort of all the main calls are Zelensky and his chief of staff, Andriy Yermak.
Who is a controversial figure.
Well, everyone is a controversial figure.
In your mind, especially with this, the promotion of is it now the ministry? He's now an advisor to the president. That, of course, is interesting from a business perspective because there were comments very early on by those in business in Ukraine. They were worried about being nationalized. Industries from energy to what is now military production. In your mind, are those fears valid?
Well, I can speak to military production. I think what's happening is that there was a decision to really expand that sphere, which is critical for Ukraine's survival, especially in things like drone production, to the private sector. So there's hundreds of individual producers that are all competing for this projects and are being paid by the government, partially with Western assistance. And we have seen the results in the drone industry of Ukraine really taking a leap and developing technologies that allow it to strike very long distances, more than 1,000 miles away in Russia, and really dominating the battlefield with drones in a way that Russia cannot, even though Russia has a much bigger industrial base.
And today, the drone warfare between Russia and Ukraine is the most deadly.
Well, it's certainly critical, because everything is now determined by drones. FPV drones that cost a couple of $100 can now kill tanks, and that cost millions of dollars. And they're being used every day.
In your mind, when it comes to the situation today in Ukraine, is it more or less corrupt than before the invasion?
Well, it's hard to say. War obviously corrupts. Every war creates opportunities for corruption. We've seen it in every war in human history. Just read Catch-22. What Ukraine also has is a very robust independent media, and so it does expose instances of corruption. The scandal of the defense ministry, where the result of which the minister had to leave and some of his deputies ended up in jail, was because of exposure by the Ukrainian media about kickbacks in the procurement of actually eggs for the military, and you have scandals breaking out all the time, and action is being taken when it's public. So I think this is the strength of Ukraine when compared to Russia, where I'm sure there is just as much more corruption, but because it's swept under the rug, very often you see the results of that in the underperformance of the Russian military.
Yeah, we've seen Saudi Arabia and the UAE both instrumental in conversations between the Russians and the Ukrainians, working with the United States. How interesting is that to you? Because you and I have both covered the Gulf countries for a long time now. I think that seeing that foreign policy influence in quite this way is really a new move for the Gulf. Yeah, well, it's a trio, really. It's Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Turkey. And I think they all three work in coordination on key issues. Obviously, the prisoner exchanges, but also exchanges of this recent hostage swap deal, in which my colleague, Evan Gershkovich, was released in Turkey, was also partially negotiated with the help of Saudi Arabia. And actually, President Putin publicly thanked Saudi Arabia for its help in this. And so these three countries have this unique position of being aligned with the U.S., but also having full relations with Russia. They have not imposed any sanctions. There are flights every day from Dubai or from Istanbul to Moscow. And so they have these lines of communication and are trusted by both sides. Yeah, but it's interesting, isn't it? Because a few years ago, I would have suggested that Saudi Arabia or the UAE be the conduit for conversations, for example, with China, between the U.S. and China. And privately, I got a lot of pushback from U.S. officials who were not interested in allowing that to happen. But this invasion really sort of upset the table, in a sense, and brought the Gulf Arab countries very much into the fore of international relations in a way that they weren't before. Right. But also, the U.S. has a direct line to China. I mean, the U.S. and Chinese officials meet and talk. That's not the case on higher levels between the U.S. and Russia. Yeah. So they need all the help they can get. Exactly. And, it's an issue of trust. There has to be a place for this exchange, for example. Yeah. That both sides trust. Turkey or Saudi Arabia, UAE are one of these places. You're also the author of a book, The Siege of Mecca. Obviously, you covered what's been a drastic change for the kingdom in the last several years with King Salman and Mohammed bin Salman, his son, the crown prince. In your mind, does Saudi Arabia today have an issue when it comes to how quickly they've modernized, how quickly they've become, frankly, a new country under MBS's reforms? Well, it's hard to say. The one answer to this is that we haven't really seen any pushback that is concerning. There hasn't been violence, there hasn't been protests. So the society seems to be accepting all this, also because society has changed. Yes. With such a huge share of the population being young and much more open to these new ideas, to having access to phones, which has changed everything. Yes, exactly. So Saudi Arabia of today is a very different country from Saudi Arabia of even 10 years ago. Yeah. And I think the history of the book of the Siege of Mecca and the actual Siege of Mecca was that in 1979, as a prize for supporting the government retaking the Grand Mosque of Mecca, which was taken by a bunch of radicals from all over the world, the government of Saudi Arabia at the time agreed to reverse the slow liberalization of the country and to give the religious establishment control over much of the society. So that has ended under Mohammed bin Salman. The religious police was disbanded, and this, frankly, the country's on social level, in terms of personal freedoms, especially for women, is so much more open than it was a few years ago. Yeah. So they have learned the lessons, in your mind, of what it means to frankly, hand over your power to religious autocracy.
Well, yeah, absolutely. But also, times have changed all over the world.
Yeah. Talk to me about Afghanistan, because obviously you had a front row seat for not only the war in Afghanistan, but also, of course, the evacuation of the U.S. and the U.K. and other NATO members as they decided to leave that country. Yeah. Disaster to disaster. Where are we today?
Well, there are two ways of looking at it, right? I mean, on one hand, yes, the Taliban regime is terrible. The restrictions on women are harrowing. Girls cannot go to school. Women have a hard time having permission to work. But if you were to ask ordinary Afghans, especially in villages, not in the cities, many would tell you that this is all terrible, but there is no war.
Yeah.
Nobody's dying. And this is a new thing for Afghanistan. For 40 years, there was constant war.
Yes.
And so and that explains why there is no resistance to the Taliban today. Because no matter how difficult the restrictions are, the fact that people do not have to bury their children every day, the fact that there's no bombings, no raids, they can travel the country, go to markets, visit each other, I think still outweighs any appeal that the resistance might have against the Taliban for now.
In your mind, what is the responsibility of the West to these women that we told you can live a modern, full life?
I think it's huge.
Abandoned.
I think it's huge. I mean, there were many promises made to the people of Afghanistan over the course of decades, actually, 20 years of Western presence there. And then one day the US just picked up and left, with people trying to cling on to the wheels of the planes taking off in Kabul airport. I was there watching it.
Yes. Is this a stain on the Biden presidency?
I think it's a stain not just on the Biden presidency. I think it's a stain on the collective record of the West and the US and on the credibility that the US has with potential allies. And I would say more. I think this is one of the reasons that inspired President Putin to invade Ukraine, because watching the disaster in Kabul in the summer of 2021, he could not help himself but conclude that we have nothing to fear from the West. And also, it's one of the reasons why the U.S. and others refused to give weapons to Ukraine before the war, because the images of the Taliban driving Humvees and MRAPs and even flying Blackhawks were enough to convince the U.S. and allies that if we give weapons to the Ukrainians, we'll see the same once the Russians take over Kiev. So it was a double blow to the Ukrainians.
You see this in many ways the way I do myself, which is so many years living outside of the United States. I tend to look at the events that happen in the world through an American lens, but then look askance at what's happening in America. You look at these two candidates. Give me the pros and cons, for the rest of the world, whether it be what's happening today in Ukraine, what's happening today in Gaza, the situation in the region, in the Middle East, where, frankly, U.S. Influence still there, but waning.
Yeah, well, I think the biggest issue, the biggest question for the two of them is which one will be able to rally the biggest posse?
Yeah.
Who will be most able to rally allies? And there are two ways of looking at it. If you look at Kamala Harris, just like President Biden, she's very good at, saying the right things, at praising the alliance networks that the U.S. has built, at comforting allies. Trump, on the other hand, during his presidency, through the virtue of his unpredictability, through the virtue of being a bit of a loose cannon, actually forced these allies to do things they didn't want to do. He forced the Europeans to ramp up spending on defense, which did prove critical once Russia invaded, which actually was, in retrospect, a very smart move. So that's really the difference between the two approaches. We'll see what happens.
What is your greatest fear as we head into this election?
Well, it's obviously very painful to watch the polarization in the U.S., the political violence. We've had 2 assassination attempts already. And, the rest of the world looks at the U.S. as a guarantor. Well, the rest of the democratic world looks at the U.S. as the guarantor of, the continuation of democracy around the world, of the leader of the free world, to use a very old language from the Cold War, but it's true. And so any internal weakness in the U.S. Is actually a threat to the rest of the democracies around the world.
Yeah. And as someone who was born in the Soviet Union, and you've seen quite a bit in your time as a journalist, in your mind, are we less safe today than we were even a few decades ago, simply because of not just that polarization, but frankly, because so many have sought to take advantage of it?
Well, I mean, we're probably safer today than 3 decades ago, 4 decades ago, and safer today than during the Cold War. But obviously, the end of history did not happen. The West's victory in the Cold War was a temporary one, and we now have this reassertion of the alliance of autocracies: Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and various odds and bits like Belarus. That is really challenging in the democratic order and is trying to create an alternative to it. And they have the resources, they have the will, and the West is not yet apparently ready to take on this challenge. Nobody wants to pay more taxes to build up military industries. The West's military industrial base is depleted, as the war in Ukraine has shown.
Yeah. Yaroslav, it's great to have you. No Country for Love, new book, everybody buy it.
Thanks
so much. Waleed, thank you so much for joining me. I want to kick off by asking you to tell us how you see the situation in Lebanon today.
I hope it won't be an endless war like the war that started in Gaza and then in the West Bank, Lebanon. I hope so, but I have no clues. Unless we imagine a political solution. The political solution is, according to me, to try to go back to the armistice truce agreement, armistice signed in 1949 by the Lebanese state through UN with the Israeli state, 1949, which established regulations of no war, but no peace.
Yeah.
I hope so. But
does that mean that you advocate for a normalization of relations with Israel?
No, we had our relationship during decades was, we are in a state of war, not state of peace, but how should I say, a truce, not active war.
Yes.
A truce.
But in order for diplomatic efforts to take place,
yes,
there'll have to be some kind of normalization, no?
No, but you have to, you've got to have a UN, effective UN working. Now the UN after Gaza is paralyzed. Okay. We count on whom? Who is the arbiter? Nobody.
Yeah.
Nobody. And who can stop Netanyahu? The US? Maybe? I don't know.
How telling was it that the attacks on Hezbollah came just one day after the US representative was in Israel having meetings to calm the situation?
It means that they don't care about the US representative. They just don't care. I mean, you're speaking about Hochstein.
Yes.
He doesn't care. The Israelis, Netanyahu, doesn't care about him. He dismisses any effort, although minimal, of US administration to try to appease a little bit, to cool it down.
Who does this situation benefit?
He said, Netanyahu, that's the whole issue now. He said that he is willing to change the whole Middle Eastern order. What does it mean? That's the question. And he's now planning a whole scheme for the Middle East, replacing the old scheme that was established by, how should I say, starting Balfour, starting Sykes-Picot. Now Netanyahu wants a new scheme.
Like new friends?
No. Wars everywhere that could end up in, maybe, I hope not, total chaos of the area.
Yeah. When you think of what happened on October 7th and the aftermath, in your mind, was it a mistake for Hamas to attack Israel?
Look, to be frank with you, I supported the Hamas action. Because,
on October 7th?
Yes. And I was criticized by many ambassadors, amongst them the American ambassador. Okay. But the people of Gaza, 60% of the people of Gaza are refugees from Palestine of 1948. And the settlements that were attacked, plus the lies, remember the lies that, children were beheaded, and it proved to be a lie. But this land is for them inside, in prison, for the last 76 years, is their land. Now, did anybody, Hezbollah, Hamas, the international opinion, the international world, predicted that this war will be endless? I don't know.
In light of that, was it a mistake, given what we're seeing on the ground today and what's coming now to Lebanon?
Easy to say it was a mistake. No, easy.
Yeah.
I don't, after all, you have Palestinian people. I mean, erasing them from the map, like what is now being done in Gaza. Later on, trying to force them to emigrate towards the East Bank. And King Abdullah made a very brilliant speech at UN. Somebody's listening? I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay. Lebanon, well, the question is now if Netanyahu will use the same, he's already using the same, that, I want to erase Hamas. Now he's using the same rhetoric as for Hezbollah.
Yeah. Over the years covering Lebanon, I've often heard from various groups that they would welcome Israeli action to take out Hezbollah.
Okay, but I mean, also over the years, we have a decade or 2 decades of Israeli occupation of the south of Lebanon. We have in 1982, the Israelis came to West Beirut, invaded Beirut. Then they withdrew. So let's. I hope they will reconsider local parties, reconsider past experiences, and even Netanyahu reconsider invading part of south of Lebanon. Part, I said, I don't know where, but part. He's saying that, or his defense minister is saying that.
Yeah.
Gala.
What is Hassan Nasrallah's next move?
Next move, he will just he stick to his policy by answering back, trying to hurt Israel. Up till now, he sticks to his policy where he was precise in one of his interviews, the last one, that, I will stick to hit military bases, which is justified maybe. But I mean, in war, any mistake can happen from both sides.
Mm-hmm.
Plus the fact that the Israelis are not only hitting military targets, are hitting anything. Now you have 500,000 Lebanese displaced.
Yeah. Tell me this, Hassan Nasrallah's plan or strategy, as you say, do you believe he still gets his orders directly from Tehran?
I don't see him distancing himself from the Iran, and I don't buy this policy that the Iranians have dropped him.
So Iran hasn't abandoned Hezbollah, in your mind? With that being said, what happens next? Because it seems as if Mr. Netanyahu is not going to hold back.
At the same time, although the blows were terribly hard, losing high-rank allies or officers, okay, but it's not easy also to see that, again, for the 3rd time or 4th time, I don't remember now, the whole population of the south are being displaced to go to where?
Yeah. Tell me this, how much has Hezbollah's capacity to do damage been degraded?
I don't know. I have no idea. I'm not a military expert. I have no idea.
But we've seen
the excuse, the official excuse of the Israelis, they want to bring back the citizens to the northern part of Israel, to the settlements and to the cities. Okay, we can say the same thing. Also, we want to bring back, they were 100,000, now they are 500,000. Our citizens to the south of Lebanon. This precludes an agreement via the United Nations. Truce agreement or ceasefire or 1701.
Yeah. Who can push the Israelis to that kind of agreement? Because you're saying that the United States has no leverage.
They should have, but they have no. They don't want. They don't want now the main concern is the electoral race, and blood is becoming. I mean, there's hundreds of thousands of casualties are being massacred here.
Yes. So the United States that's obsessed with the presidential race is of no help in this situation.
United States, the so-called international community, but this whole international community is just paralyzed because the UN is paralyzed.
Yeah. And that works for whom? To have a paralyzed UN?
Well, he has a free hand. Mr. Netanyahu and his people have a free hand on the area.
Yeah. Tell me this. When you think about what happens next, is there any party in Lebanon or any leader in Lebanon who you see powerful enough to effect a kind of truce with Israel?
We have to work on that. I don't see any party now betting on Israel. But I mean, we are divided, of course. We have to work on the minimum of national unity and be able, maybe through the French envoy, Le Drian, to elect a president, because we need a president. We cannot stay like that with a caretaker prime minister and this void in administration.
What needs to happen in order for Lebanon to get
we
there?
need to elect a president without preconditions, a consensus president, adequate one, good one, to be able to represent Lebanon officially everywhere.
Yeah.
And to take care of the country.
Yeah. Do you think that we need to see a much younger political class?
Well, much younger political class. Now it's, do we have time now to look at a much younger or older?
Well, they did the same thing in the United States, and now we see what we see. The president deciding halfway into the campaign that he's not going to be able to continue it. So there is an argument for having younger people in office,
okay,
no?
Okay, but now it's I think it's a trivial issue. In the United States, I mean, be it a younger or an older, it doesn't change anything. The machine there is totally different, whereby you have interest groups, financial groups controlling the real power there.
Yeah. What does this mean in your mind for Lebanon today in terms of that election? Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump. Is one going to be better than the other for Lebanon?
I don't see any change for us, or for the Middle East, or for the Palestinians, because we've seen their past rhetoric. Once Kamala Harris, once she mentioned the necessity of having a two-state solution. Okay, but I mean, the two-state solution is becoming a joke. Why? Because where is this Palestinian state will be erected, will be placed? In the West Bank, you have 800,000 settlers there. Who is going to displace or tell them, go back to home? This area is our area. This territory is our territory, Palestine.
Yeah. What about the United States, the United Kingdom, all the Western powers who have warned their citizens about evacuating, about leaving Lebanon, while at the same time, at least in the case of the United States, continuing to support Israel's war machine with billions and billions worth of weapons?
They care about the safety of their citizens. They don't care about us.
Are they hypocrites?
Yes. They care about the citizens of the safety of the citizens. Where is the active action of the United States, United Kingdom, or others? I mean, even also the Russians said the same thing, but the Russians are becoming, how should I say, not powerless, but not effective in Lebanon or the Middle East because of the war in Ukraine.
Was that war a mistake in your mind?
Maybe he was dragged to this war, Putin. Maybe because he thought at the beginning that, well, the Ukrainian regime will collapse. It didn't collapse because there was preparation for this trap years ago.
Yeah. So you think he was misinformed?
I think so. Somebody, I mean, all great leaders are sometimes misinformed.
Yeah. And you think he's a great leader?
A great leader, I'm saying that not in the sense of being great. I'm big leader, sorry.
Yeah.
Big leader. Okay.
Who's
a great leader now?
Anybody?
No.
No.
The area of big leaders like Charles de Gaulle, maybe Kennedy, maybe. But even Kennedy fall in the trap of the Tonkin affair.
Bay of Tonkin. Right. Tell me this: there have been lots of talk about China getting somehow involved. Do you see that as something that's realistic?
Do you see Chinese military bases in the Middle East? The Middle East is surrounded, invaded by American bases everywhere.
Yeah.
They have one small one, I think, in Djibouti. That's it.
But China's been instrumental in certain deals between Saudi Arabia and Iran, elsewhere. They have shown that they can be an interlocutor. Is that something you see ever happening in this case?
No, I've seen they were instrumental in trying to cool down the war of Yemen, Saudi Arabia. That's it. And they have succeeded.
Yeah.
In a way.
Again, back to Hezbollah and their capacity to wage war. Are they in a better position than they were in 2006?
Can't tell you. I don't know. Who knows?
What's your sense?
They are still there. They are still there. Okay, but I mean, they have suffered great casualties, but they're still there.
Yeah. Still dangerous.
I mean, this is also from your point of view, they are dangerous. From some Lebanese point of view, they are not dangerous. They are defending Lebanon. So it's subject to discussion.
I don't have a point of view. I'm a journalist.
Sorry?
I don't have a point of view.
No, I'm just answering you. You said dangerous. I'm saying for some Lebanese, it's a little bit different.
Talk to me about what happens next. You say that this is a country that needs a president. This is a country that needs some kind of truce with Israel. And also this is a country, frankly, that you and I have discussed this many times, is in the midst still of an economic crisis.
Yes. Okay, but I mean, let's go back to priorities. Re-establish the truce of 1949 that regulated the relations between the State of Israel and the State of Lebanon. 1949. I think it's still valid.
Yeah. Okay. Is that something that the Prime Minister is working on?
He can't do it on his own if he's not supported unanimously by all the parties of Lebanon, and he can't do it without the election of a president. He should be part of the complete administration, legally speaking, and officially.
So everything that's been happening has put again a major strain on Lebanon's resources. Walk me through the humanitarian effort that needs to happen now.
We need mattresses, we need medicine, clean water. What else? We need space to host, of course you have the schools, but you have to equip the schools to host tens of thousands of displaced people. We need international help. In this field, yes, we need international help, because we cannot expect any international help except maybe in this field.
Yes.
Maybe.
So we're talking about specifically World Food Program.
World Food Program, yes.
Yeah. And they've been in contact. They are moving, or?
They are moving slowly. But I mean, also the war is not moving slowly. The war is moving rapidly.
Yes.
It's a race against time.
Yes.
Race with time.
And given where we are today in terms of the economic crisis, Riyad Salameh.
I mean, the economic crisis happened. People were bankrupt totally, public sector. People, thanks to the non-establishment of the capital control, non-appliance of the capital control required to safeguard the economy, well, people got rich, terribly rich. So it's not the issue now. Who's going now to apply the regulations of the IMF? Nobody. Now it's war.
Yes. And who is at fault in your mind?
Everybody.
Every party, every leader.
Everybody. That's an old, long story, everybody, because nobody can say, I'm not responsible. Everybody will accuse the other. So let's say anybody will accuse the other side. Let's say anybody.
Yeah. Talk to me about that level of fault. Do you feel a sense of guilt at all for your role in Lebanon's past?
Well, we are, Lebanon, it's composed of sects, of confessions, of clans, of power groups. Okay, and This has been going on for decades, maybe a century. Some people, some Western embassies with local people thought, well, they might bring a new class, political class. Well, bringing a new political class to power without abolishing confessionalism lead to nowhere.
Yes.
Are still in the same vicious circle.
Do you see the last century and the beginning of this one as Lebanon as a failed experiment?
Let's now go back to the realities. The war, as if it's a destiny for the Lebanese every decade or more, 20 years, to have a new war. And now this war might be, I said might be, without a political solution, might be endless.
Yeah.
So let's go back to war. The necessity of...
But without
surviving.
A functioning state.
We still can function.
So the dysfunction continues to be functional.
Yes.
That can't be good enough. It's certainly failing people today.
We have to work on the ground, the available means that we have on the ground, waiting for maybe international aid in humanitarian aid. But
this is why everyone leaves. Because they have no hope that the political class will change, that the situation with Israel will change, the economic situation. That's why everybody leaves. I mean, what's the message to young people? Why would they stay?
I have no message now. My main concern is how to be able to host adequately the refugees of the south part of Lebanon or of Lebanon. I have no other message. I mean, I don't have the time now to think about what you're asking. Sorry.
And you're thinking about people here.
People here, how to survive. Okay, because people are, I'm sitting here in my apartment still, but I mean, other people have lost their homes.
Yes.
They have lost everything. How to give them an adequate answer for their security, for their basic security.
Yes, and in the past you've had the help of Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and other Gulf countries.
Yes, but in the past, the war was 33 or 34 days. Now it's almost a year.
Yeah. And the Gulf aid, do you anticipate it will come back to Lebanon?
I hope so. I don't know.
Yeah. That kind of aid usually comes with strings attached and demands.
No.
Progress.
In Qatar in 2006, there was no conditions. Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait. Well.
So you want aid from the Gulf?
Plus, I mean, the Iranians helped us, helped Hezbollah. Okay, but at that time they had money. No, I don't think so.
Yeah. Final question, Benjamin Netanyahu. There are some who say that this is just another ploy to stay in power. How do you view him?
I don't share your opinion that, well, he's in trouble. And even if he's in trouble, he doesn't care. He has the majority of the Israelis backing him. It reminds me of the conquer of Judea and Samaria at the time of the prophet Samuel. He said it somewhere. He mentioned Samuel somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So this is why I read part of the Bible. I said part. And I'm listening to conferences on the Bible. Strangely enough, we are back to 2,000 years ago.
Biblical times.
Yes.
Walid, thank you so much for joining me.
Please.
Istanbul, definitely a glory of the world. Istanbul bridges two continents, marries civilizations that highlights the best of the Roman, Byzantine, and Ottoman empires. Take a look and see. Perhaps the most popular among tourists is taking the Bosphorus cruise in Istanbul. They say a trip to the city won't be complete without taking this route. It provides a majestic overview of the city, taking both European and Asian shores. You'll see century-old places and mansions to marvel at. There are also several options of cruises to take for your convenience. The Hagia Sophia is definitely a sight to see too. It's a splendid church-turned-mosque-turned-museum that's considered one of the world's greatest architectural treasures. Also head over to the Archaeology Museum in Istanbul. It is considered one of the city's hidden gems, displaying one of the world's richest collections of classical antiquities. Here, you'll find the marvelous sarcophagus of Alexander the Great, depicting important phases of his life, the blue-tiled Karaman Marab, the beautiful tiled pavilion, and the Treaty of Kadesh, which is known as the world's earliest surviving peace treaty. When it comes to shopping, Istanbul has its Grand Bazaar. You can go bargain hunting to your heart's delight. It is over 500 years old, but still one of the largest covered bazaars in the world. Locals visit the place every day to shop and bargain like pros. The Grand Bazaar is also known for its carpets, leather, ceramic, jewelry, plus souvenirs you can bring home. Not to be missed are the local markets that will allow you a taste of different cultures of continents. Turkey's kitchen is in fact known to be the richest of all. Their dishes are known to be made with only fresh produce. Plus, you can buy the ingredients firsthand at the local markets. Then, of course, you can't miss the Galata Tower. It is one other way to see the best of the city. You'll get a 360-degree panoramic view of Istanbul. Its very high tower also has a restaurant and cafe for you to dine in at the 9th floor. Feel free to enjoy the view and the food too. Definitely a great way to see, experience, and absorb the beauty that is Istanbul.
At Al Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Al Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
my campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on the Rizkan Show for empowering conversation.
Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every single weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burgess-Watson. Coming up on the programme. With just 12 days until the US presidential election, Kamala Harris labels Donald Trump a fascist. He brands her a major threat to democracy. A senior editor at the Los Angeles Times resigns after the newspaper's owner reportedly prevented the editorial board from endorsing the Democratic presidential nominee, Kamala Harris. France's foreign minister says today's Lebanon aid conference has secured $1 billion in humanitarian and military assistance. And the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has called for a just peace in Ukraine during a meeting with President Putin. Welcome. As the race for the White House enters its final stretch, a heated exchange of insults has erupted between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Well, during a televised event, Kamala Harris, the Democratic presidential nominee, expressed her strong beliefs about her opponent, labelling Trump a fascist, adding that he seeks unchecked power. Well, in a swift rebuttal, the former President Donald Trump fired back, accusing Harris of possessing a, quote, warped mind, and deeming her a significant threat to democracy. Well, as the campaign heats up, Harris is scheduled to participate in a rally alongside former President Barack Obama in Atlanta, Georgia, aiming to galvanize support in a crucial swing state. Meanwhile, Trump plans to hold a series of campaign events in Arizona, further intensifying the battle for votes in this pivotal election. With less than 2 weeks remaining until polling day on the 5th of November, recent polls indicate the race may come down to the wire in key battleground states, making every campaign appearance and statement absolutely critical. For reaction to this and their thoughts on how both candidates are doing, I'm joined now by Donald Trump's spiritual advisor, Pastor Mark Burns. Thank you very much indeed for being with us once again. I'm also joined by political and civil rights activist Reverend Mark Thompson. Welcome to both of you. I don't know if you've met before. You're both religious men. You're both called Mark, but I think the similarity might end there in terms of your political opinions. I'd like to just start by asking about some of the language that's been used in the last 24 hours on the campaign trail. We've had Kamala Harris calling Donald Trump a fascist and a danger to the well-being and safety of America. Let me just ask you, first of all, Reverend Thompson, what's Kamala Harris getting at here?
By calling him a fascist?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I do know Pastor Burns. He's been on my show in the past. Kamala Harris was responding to the major headlines over the past 48 hours or 72 hours, really, that Donald Trump's own chief of staff declared Donald Trump, John Kelly, his former chief of staff, John Kelly, declared Donald Trump a fascist. She's not getting at anything. In fact, it's disappointing that the media is trying to make her the culprit for being the original source of calling Trump a fascist. She really isn't. She was, when she was asked last night in the town hall, I watched it. It was in response to these reports. You have a former decorated military officer and a former chief of staff who actually declared Donald Trump a fascist. And based upon that, I think we can all agree, based upon John Kelly's own words, that Donald Trump is, in fact, a fascist.
Pastor Mark Burns, how damaging do you think it is that John Kelly is using the word fascist to describe Donald Trump and saying that he admired dictators?
Well, it's laughable, to be honest. I mean, again, Johnny Kelly may have been a decorated veteran military strategist that has represented and served our nation well. But as chief of staff, he is simply just a disgruntled, fired former employee who was embarrassed because he was unable to live up to the expectations of the chief of staff and the position in which he was hired to do. And so this is, the American people know who are the real fascists are. It is the Harris-Biden administration that weaponized the Department of Injustice against a political opponent. This is what fascists do, like in a banana republic. To even the sitting president of the United States of America just utilize his platform to suggest that the leading candidate, and by all polls from the liberal left and the conservative right, are suggesting that Donald Trump is leading this race and will strong chances of most likely be the 47th president of the United States of America, is stating that Donald Trump needs to be incarcerated. So let us imprison the leading candidate of the opposition in America. This is what fascists do. And the Democratic Party has made strong positions in weaponizing the Department of Injustice against a political opponent. That's what the American people see. And so when they hear a disgruntled former employee, fired employee in the name of John Kelly, it moves the needle very little.
Okay, Reverend Thompson, John Kelly, just a disgruntled former employee. I saw you shaking your head there, but what have you got to say?
No, that's absurd. And it's not, Pastor Burns calls it laughable, but it's shameful that as a Christian, he would not condemn what else John Kelly said about the person he spiritually advises. To be a Christian and to condone someone lionizing Adolf Hitler is akin to what Christians did during the Holocaust themselves. A lot of Christians went along with what Hitler did, tragically. John Kelly repeated also what Donald Trump has said, and that's not the first time we've heard that. Donald Trump has an admiration for Adolf Hitler. His own wife, first wife, Ivanka, talked about how he kept Mein Kampf by his bedside. That is the epitome of a fascist and the epitome of fascism. Any and all of us should decry anyone who lionizes Adolf Hitler. And Kelly was simply reporting on that. We know who Donald Trump is. His own father was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. We can't deny any of those things. Donald Trump is a fascist, is an admirer of Hitler, and a racist and a white supremacist, not to mention a sexist and a xenophobe. He is trying to reach out to the lowest common denominator of this country to stay in power, to hold on to this last dying grasp that white supremacy and fascism and racism and xenophobia and sexism still has in this country. He's using it to continue to keep the country divided as well. That is his agenda. That has always been his agenda. And a lot of Republicans hope that this is the end of his political career. The Republican Party can't grow, can't build, can't expand its numbers because Donald Trump, unfortunately, is still a leader of that party and appealing to this lowest common discriminatory denominator. Those are the facts. So it's more than just a disgruntled employee. And many former military heads, many former employees, many former Republicans, including the former Secretary of Defense himself, Dick Cheney, who styled himself, gave himself the nickname of Darth Vader, including his daughter, Liz Cheney. Not to mention the overwhelming numbers of Nikki Haley voters who are going to vote for Kamala Harris. So even where Pastor Burns is getting his numbers about the election being inevitable for his candidate, that's just false.
Pastor Burns, Donald Trump describing Kamala Harris at a town hall in North Carolina.
What's he laughing about? What is so funny?
Sorry, let me just get to the question.
What's laughable to me?
But see, that's what buffoons do.
And your comments.
Buffoons and Uncle
okay, so am I going to be able to speak?
Laugh and skin and
am I going to be able to speak?
And that's what Pastor
Because the reality of it is, what is scary to me and what's sad to me is when you start talking about Christianity, it's how can a preacher of the gospel of Jesus Christ support?
Sorry, I have to ask you to speak one at a time. Sorry.
Contrary to God's word.
Yet decry Hitler.
He doesn't know the things about manners because he had opportunity.
Reverend Thompson, please let's let Mark Burns speak.
He's not trained in television, so he needs to be educated in how to properly communicate on television. Number one, he had his opportunity to speak, so now I'm going to speak. So number one, here we go. Number one, the fact that this preacher of the gospel of Jesus Christ is on international television talking about his support for policies that are contrary to God's word. The Bible says that it is an abomination for men to sleep with men, but yet you, preacher, preach for it. You, preacher, are speaking more so to the populace, what's popular, instead of standing on the word of God. You, sir, if you support Kamala Harris, if you support the Democratic Party, sir, you should get in your pulpit and preach the gospel truth. You cannot talk about Christians and Adolf Hitler when you, sir, are preaching against policies that are contrary.
Okay, sorry, we're not hearing either of you at the moment. We're not hearing either of you. Reverend Thompson, you go ahead.
That's why the majority of Christians are supporting Donald Trump. Number two, let's talk about the black community. You want to keep utilizing this poor, horrible emotionalism policies that black people are being used by the Republican Party. The reality,
gentlemen,
93% of black people was voting for Biden and Kamala Harris. Now we at 73% because black people are realizing that they've been used by the Democratic Party, and black black slavers like you who keep black people on the slave plantation. They using you, sir. The reality of it is the only thing that Kamala Harris is selling black people is the color of her skin. She's not talking about black schools. She's not talking about black empowerment, educationally.
Pastor Burns,
You are
Pastor Burns.
the only thing that Kamala Harris.
Pastor Burns, can we let Reverend Thompson speak? We're not able to hear both of you at the same time. Pastor Burns.
He asked me a question and he cut me off. So
I'm sorry, we've tried listening to both of you at once, but it just isn't possible.
He cannot overtalk me. The point is, you can't talk about being a Christian and support Democrat policies, sir, that are contrary to God's word. You can't talk about black empowerment when you have a candidate that's not talking about black schools, not talking about black businesses. That's not talking. What is she offering the black community? Donald Trump is offering policies that are changing the lives of black community. The only thing that Democrat Party and Kamala Harris is selling black people is the color of her skin, and black men are tired of it. That's why only 73% of black people are not supporting Kamala Harris. That, sir, spells an end of the Democratic Party reign on black community.
Pastor Burns, I must allow Reverend Thompson to respond to some of the comments you've just made.
Remember,
Reverend Thompson.
Me off, so let's just be clear about that.
Are you finished?
Are you finished, sir?
Are you finished, Burns?
Preacher?
All right.
Preacher?
So first of all,
go teach your church about how it's okay to kill babies. Go teach your church how it's okay to sleep with other men when the Bible says you shouldn't even do it.
Let's let Reverend Thompson speak.
You seem a little defensive. We didn't bring up sleeping with other men. Pastor Burns, that's what you do in the closet,
it's a policy, sir. It's a policy, brother. It's a policy.
Who
if you're going to talk about all of it. You talk about Adolf Hitler like Trump supported Adolf Hitler. So Trump has the greatest support amongst black people in the history of the Republican Party, sir.
But
they're tired of lies coming from mouths like
denounce
you.
Adolf
You,
Hitler
sir,
right now.
are the black slaver.
I dare you to denounce Adolf Hitler. Denounce him.
Of course we denounce Adolf Hitler. Just like we denounce the Ku Klux Klan, sir. You're speaking of foolishness. Black folks are tired of these emotionalism comments.
They want to see their children grow. A member of the Ku Klux Klan.
They want to see businesses grow. They want to see black businesses.
Speak for black people, Burns.
That's what Donald Trump.
Burns, you don't speak for African Americans.
You don't speak for black
Burns,
America.
you don't speak for African Americans.
There is no black America. There's only America, and they're black people. Not all black people.
You just brought up black Americans.
You
just brought up black Americans.
You speak for one group of people. Trump don't support Adolf Hitler, and it's foolish and childish
you just brought up black Americans
to say that. But you don't have policy, sir. You only have emotionalism. Trump wants to make sure that 500 black-owned businesses that are created in America.
Because you can't defend your position to have an intelligent conversation.
Pastor Burns, let's let Reverend Thompson speak.
Talk about policy, sir.
Jibber jabbering.
Talk about policy.
Reverend Thompson, go ahead.
Okay. He's doing his whole step and fetch it routine because he has no argument.
That's what people don't care about.
Let me try to enlighten the audience.
People don't care.
If I may. Let me try to enlighten the audience,
sir.
if I may.
Talk about policy. Educate
Mark
yourself.
Burns
Talk
is
about policy.
paid Uncle Tom for Donald Trump. He is on the payroll. I'm not on the payroll for any candidate.
People on the chains
he
for
is
free.
a paid Uncle Tom.
Pastor Burns, please can we let Reverend Thompson speak? Reverend Thompson.
All of these are talking points that right-wing black Uncle Tom Republicans used against African Americans. Back during slavery, people like Mark Burns would have been shot by Harriet Tubman
like
they
you
would
to
have stopped
keep
the
black
Underground
people
Railroad.
in chains. That's what they did, and they used black intimidation. They used black intimidation to use black folks to do
I want
the
to
dirty work.
apologize
They
to
were
the
called
host of the
black
audience.
slavers.
You realize this
That's
segment is over because that's his job. His job is to derail real conversation.
Remember, you cut me off, sir. This was a civil conversation until you cut me off. Don't forget that. You could have kept your mouth quiet and let me finish my statement.
Okay, well, you know what, then, Mark?
You opened this up, sir.
I apologize. Watch this buck dancer can't accept an apology. I apologize for cutting you off. Now, can you close your mouth?
I received that.
I apologize.
I received it.
I'm man enough to do that. I'm man enough to apologize to you. You aren't man enough to decry Hitler or denounce Donald Trump's racism. You aren't man enough to do that.
Are you, Pastor Burns?
He probably hung up.
Sports. Apologize to your church, because that's the policy, sir, you preaching from your pulpit and from your position.
He won't accept it, but
he's such the gospel of Jesus Christ. I receive your apology, sir. I do receive your apology, and I thank you for doing that. Thank you for me, but now go and apologize to your church for teaching them false doctrine, for supporting the Democratic Party for policies that are contrary to God's words, Reverend.
So in what world is it your right, even in the gospel, for you to stand in judgment of me right here on this television? You don't know what I preach.
I'm only giving.
I am not.
I'm gonna tell you this.
Let me talk. Don't cut me off now. Don't cut me off.
Right, go ahead.
I am not an employee of either Kamala Harris, Tim Walz, or the Democratic Party. You are a full-time, paid employee.
I don't get paid
of a sexist, a rapist, a man been convicted of multiple crimes. So let me ask you a question. Let me give you the benefit of the doubt. As his spiritual advisor, are you counseling him on repentance for his sins and his behavior? I'm going to ask you that question. Or do you counsel the person you spiritually advise, Donald Trump? You're his spiritual advisor, presumably. You still work for him. Do you advise him? See, you want to judge me and say what I'm preaching.
Jesus Christ.
But wait a minute. No, I'm talking. I'm talking. You don't want to hear the truth.
You're asking me.
No. I'm not finished. Let me finish my question.
Okay, go ahead.
Let me finish my question. Have you advised him? Are you preaching to him about his behavior in terms of rape? Answer the question.
Okay, so now let me ask this question. This is what I preach, because I preach the real Bible in my church.
Let him answer the question, Reverend Thompson. Let him answer the question.
The Bible says this. See, this because the Bible says this. He the Son set free is free indeed. Glory to God. The Bible says that we are covered by the blood of Jesus, the blood of the Lamb, that all sins has been forgiven. Glory to God. But apparently it doesn't work for Donald Trump, right? It may work for you and your sins and in your failures. It works for you and your sins, and it works for me and my sins. But the Bible says that those that believe, that call on the name of the Lord, they shall be saved. Donald Trump has called on the name of the Lord. Donald Trump has repented from his sins. He is not the man of yesterday. Thank God that God is not a God that judges us based off of what we did yesterday. God judges us based off of who we are today and who Kamala Harris is today. She is the one that got up when somebody from the audience declared, Jesus is Lord, Jesus is King, and your candidate got up and said, you're at the wrong rally.
Pastor Burns, can I ask you a question?
Part of the Democratic Party is that they are at the wrong rally. We in the Republican Party accept the name of Jesus as the King of Kings, as the Lord of Lords, and we said proudly, preacher, go back to your church and get back to Genesis, get back to Revelations, get back to the Word of God that says that God saved all of us who have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And that concludes Donald J. Trump, who will be the 47th president of the United States.
Let me put a question to Pastor, to Reverend Thompson. Reverend Thompson, can I ask you a question? How spiritual and how religious a person is Kamala Harris?
Oh, she's very much so. She is a product of the Black religious experience, the Black church. She attended Third Street Baptist Church, pastored by the Reverend Amos Brown, who was a contemporary of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And that pretty much answers the question. She is that. She's talked about that. She's acknowledged that. She said when Joe Biden dropped out of the race, the first person she called to seek prayer with was her pastor. And he didn't have to counsel her or spiritually advise her on charges of rape and infidelity and paying off prostitutes. Now, what's interesting is that Pastor Burns has declared Donald Trump forgiven for all those things, but
the blood of Jesus.
And if you notice, all of Black America is enslaved. Donald Trump is free of sin. But we are all enslaved because we have chosen in a majority to vote for Democrats over the years because the Republican Party has not done one thing for African Americans. So that's a contradiction even in his own theology. It's a convenient theology. It's a theology of convenience that he promotes. It is a theology of convenience based upon who is lining his pockets, who is giving him legitimacy. He is on this show right now.
All right.
Because he's an story of Donald Trump. Pastor Burns has no legitimacy and no credibility whatsoever in any corridor of Black America in this country. I can guarantee that. He is known for that. So what happens is you become a big fish in a small pond.
All right, let's let him respond.
You get on shows and you can talk. Let me finish. And you can get to talk, because that's the only way you're going to be seen and heard. Otherwise, Pastor Mark Burns is irrelevant to the Black community in this country.
Okay, Pastor Burns, let me put the same question to you about Donald Trump. I'd like to ask you, how deeply spiritual and how deeply religious a man is the man who you give spiritual counsel to? And also feel free to respond after that, if you would, to the comments made by Reverend Thompson.
Well, listen, President Donald Trump is a man who is of conviction. See, for me, this is not politics. The word of God is truth.
A man who was convicted.
See, now you see how the gentleman cannot. He didn't learn manners in elementary school.
No, brother,
when I start talking, don't call me brother.
Let's let Pastor Burns.
We're Black. Don't call me brother. Because if we're brother, because for brothers for me are Black people who will lift each other up. You, sir, are not a brother. You, sir, you are the true Uncle Tom. You, sir, are the step and fetch that keeps Black people from being poor. Under the Democratic policies, why is it that Black people even now are at the lowest financially? Under the Democratic policies, why are the cities in America that are led by Democratic Party? Why is it that Democratic Party,
Reverend Thompson,
in Black communities are poor?
Reverend Thompson,
why is it that Baltimore and Chicago are poor, sir, because of the policies of the Democratic Party that you, sir, are pushing? And you, when you do stand for the Democratic policy, you do stand for all those policies that are contrary to God's word. So now let me answer my question. And maybe, just maybe, this preacher of the gospel who already asked for an apology will keep his word and allow me to speak my message without him stepping and fetching for the Democratic Party. Because that's exactly what he's doing. That's why Black men are supporting Donald Trump. Because of policy. This man gets up here and says Donald Trump has done nothing for the Black community. What was the fact that under Donald Trump, that the unemployment rate amongst Black people were at a historical low? Businesses, Black-owned businesses were at a historical all-time high. We had the fact that Black people were getting out of prison, right, because of the prison reform bill that no Democrat has done. It came under Donald Trump, and Democrats and Republicans came together and they signed off on it. What about the fact that we have opportunity zones that are creating Black-owned businesses and giving Black people an opportunity to become economic empowered? No, sir. Black people are leaving. That's why 73% are now only supporting Kamala Harris, because the only thing that you have to sell Black people is the color of her skin. That's why the first thing you talked about was her Black experience in the church. Black folks ain't caring about that. They want to make sure that their child can go to school, to an HBCU. They want to make sure that their child can own a home. They want to own a home. They want to make sure that they can put money in their 401k. They want to make sure that they can retire in an America that allows them to grow financially, prosper, and economically.
Pastor Burns.
Talking about the Black experience, like that's going to put money into people's pocket. Nobody cares that she's Black. Matter of fact, if the reality of it is this: if she was talking about policies, because Black folks know Democrats been using Black folks like you for 50 years. London Bain Johnson said we would have these N-words.
Pastor Burns, let's let Reverend Thompson speak. Let's let Reverend Thompson speak.
Donald Trump loves Jesus. That's what the matter is.
Okay.
Donald Trump would
You've
never
answered the question.
You've
answered my question.
And say you are at the wrong rally. When
You've answered my question.
Says Jesus is king. That only happens in Democratic Kamala Harris policy.
Pastor Burns, you've answered my question. You've answered my question. Let me just put one final question to Reverend Thompson, then we have to wrap up. I'm sorry, gentlemen. We've got 60 seconds left. Reverend Thompson, what did Donald Trump mean, do you think, when he said that Kamala Harris has a warped mind? What's he getting at?
His usual sexism and racism. He also said she was an SHIT VP, the same terminology he used to refer to many Black countries. And let me just say this. You asked about her religiosity. I mentioned her being a part of the Black religious experience, which is an historical one. Pastor Burns pretends to be just like he lied and said he was a member of a historically black fraternity. Kamala Harris is a member of a historical black sorority, Alpha Kappa Alpha. Pastor Burns several years ago said he was a member of Kappa Alpha Psi. He wants to belong, but he can't. And that's part of the problem. But God bless Pastor Burns anyway. We continue to pray for him. It is false.
We pray for you
that
too.
the majority of African American men,
okay, gentlemen, you're going to pray for each other, which is great.
Are supporting Donald Trump. That is absolutely false.
And you get off these step and fetch.
And he ain't got no problem with blackface, because remember, he released a photo of Hillary Clinton in blackface. He had to apologize. He had to apologize to the
preacher who's really asking black people to grow.
Gentlemen, we're coming to the end of the program. We're coming to the end of the program. My last question is to Pastor Burns. Pastor Burns, let me ask you a question.
Most definitely relevant in all communities.
Pastor Burns.
I don't paid by Donald Trump. I don't campaign or any Republican. I work for the Lord Jesus Christ, and I preach.
Pastor Burns. Pastor Burns, my final question is to you. Donald Trump has called Kamala Harris in the last 24 hours
you keep black
both lazy and stupid. Is that Christian language in your opinion? Donald Trump calling Kamala Harris lazy and stupid. Is that the language of a Christian?
Well, I could say that this black slaver that is on this camera is just good at keeping black folks right where they are when they have an opportunity to advance. That's why more and more black men are supporting Donald Trump, sir. The fact that more and more black people, this is not about criticizing a white man, because I preach under the blood of Jesus, where all colors are God's people. You, sir, are a racist. You, sir, are the true bigot. You, sir, are the reason why black people are not advancing like they should under a free America that gives us an opportunity to become all that we want under the same red and white.
Okay, gentlemen, a quick response from Reverend Thompson. We're going to wrap it up. Reverend Thompson, you have the last word.
Does he actually believe there's no longer any racism in America?
No, I never said that, sir. I never said there's most definitely.
You just said it's free.
So don't be speaking words.
Wait a minute.
America is what I said. I know you have
let me ask another question then, just to be clear.
We don't have time for another question. We don't have time for another question. I'm so sorry, gentlemen. We're going to have to end it there. We're totally out of time. Really appreciate you both taking the time and the energy to speak to us here on Al Arabiya News. Donald Trump's spiritual advisor, Pastor Mark Burns, political and civil rights activist, Reverend Mark Thompson. Thank you both very much indeed. Well, staying with the US election, and a senior editor at the Los Angeles Times has resigned after the newspaper's owner reportedly prevented the editorial board from endorsing the Democratic Vice President Kamala Harris for President of the United States. Well, in an interview with the Columbia Journalism Review, Marielle Gaza explains that she'd stepped down because the LA Times was choosing to remain silent on the election during what she called dangerous times. She said, "In dangerous times, honest people need to stand up, and this is how I am standing up." Well, Dr. Pat Soon-Shiong took to X to explain the decision. In it, he said, "So many comments about the LA Times editorial board not providing a presidential endorsement this year. Let me clarify how this decision came about. The editorial board was provided the opportunity to draft a factual analysis of all the positive and negative policies of each candidate during their tenures at the White House and how these policies affected the nation. Well, in addition, the board was asked to provide their understanding of the policies and plans enunciated by the candidates during this campaign and its potential effect on the nation in the next 4 years. In this way, with this clear and non-partisan information side by side, our readers could decide who was worthy of being president for the next 4 years. Well, instead of adopting this path as suggested, the editorial board chose to remain silent, and I accepted their decision. Please vote," read the statement. Well, for more on this, I'm joined now by the Professor of International Politics at University College Dublin's Clinton Institute, Scott Lucas. Thank you very much indeed for being with us once again here on Al Arabiya News. We heard that person resigning from the LA Times, calling these dangerous times. Do you think that's an exaggeration?
No, I think it's dangerous times. I think if you just talk about beyond the United States, if we were to talk about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, if we were to talk about the ongoing Israeli attacks on Gaza and Lebanon and the prospect of an Israeli-Iran confrontation, if we were to talk about global issues like climate change, these are indeed very dangerous times. But I think you also are probably at the most important U.S. election since 1865. And I say that beyond the very important issues that you would have, whether it be the economy, the immigration, healthcare, women's rights, especially reproductive rights, the environment. You have a man running for president who effectively tried an attempted coup in January 2021. He tried to block the orderly transfer of power to Joe Biden, who had won the election. You have a man running for president whose former White House chief of staff has said that he fits the general definition of a fascist, whose former head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has said, yes, he is a fascist. Whether or not you agree with that exact term, fascist, for Donald Trump, he has effectively said that he wants to take down the U.S. system. And indeed, those who are around him have put out a 900-page blueprint in Project 2025 to do precisely this. So it is a defining moment for the future of the American system and thus for the future of the global system.
I'd like to look a bit more deeply at the phenomenon of endorsements for political candidates in the United States. And they come from all sorts of directions. Could be a newspaper or not, as in the case of the LA Times we were just talking about there. It can also be celebrities. This is nothing new, is it, in US politics?
No, I mean, this is run for decades. And what happens is it gets kind of generalized, and especially you'd have the argument from the right that it's just like the Hollywood liberal elite, that just these lefties who come out and support Democrats. In fact, that's a misrepresentation. There are a number of Hollywood stars. I can think of a guy named John Wayne or Jimmy Stewart, who are very much firm conservative Republicans. So I think you have to get beyond the superficial notion of, quote, celebrities to talk about which celebrity you're talking about and to talk about what the political content of their endorsement is. So if you're about to ask me about Taylor Swift, for example, who I think is well known around the world, it's not that it's Taylor Swift who's endorsing Kamala Harris as a singer. It's that Taylor Swift is quite politically involved. She's quite politically involved in terms of her support of community causes. And she's quite outspoken on certain things such as women's rights and LGBT rights. So that's how I measure celebrities. It's not just simply, whether or not they've got a hit song or a hit movie, but where's their political, as it were, place? Where are the ideas that they put forth to try to make America a better society?
And what sort of a difference do they make? Do you think perhaps too much is made of the impact of a celebrity endorsement?
No, I don't, because I think if you talk about Taylor Swift, for example, the day after she endorsed Kamala Harris for president this summer, voter registration inquiries increased by 400%. 400%. That's because, there will be people who follow Taylor Swift on a day-to-day basis. They listen to her music. They follow news of her, where she is, her relationship with the football player Travis Kelce, and she uses that profile to try to mobilize people to get out the vote. So no, I think the problem we have here is we just stick the label celebrity on them. These are people of influence, and the question here is whether they use that influence in a very positive way. And I think Taylor Swift is a case where you could say yes to that.
Yeah, I think what tends to happen, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that when you agree with the celebrity and you like what they're saying, you sort of cheer them on, and when you don't, you say, well, they should stick to singing and not get involved in politics. That's something that I hear quite a lot of people say in response to a new celebrity endorsement, especially when they don't like it. It's said as well that Oprah Winfrey... Sorry, you're going to say something.
Well, I think that's just simply a shallow, dismissive way of trying to respond to something because you don't actually want to hear the political content of what is being said. And in fact, I would say that about any endorsement that's being made. So, for example, when you have celebrity endorsements which happen to be of a candidate who I might not support, let's say that, I'm not going to dismiss that celebrity and say, no, you can't do that. I think we have a society which is too quick as a whole to dismiss anybody who is not in their camp. And I think that division in camps has increased. So I wouldn't apply that to celebrities in such a dismissive way, and I hope that others would not do so. In other words, go to the content and not the messenger before you make your judgment.
Do you think the intensity and the value and the power of a celebrity endorsement has grown with the rise of social media? Do you think that sort of amplifies it even further than in the old days, for example, when Frank Sinatra endorsed JFK, or with one of the historic endorsements. Perhaps nowadays, do you think it's fair to say that with social media, a celebrity's got even more power than they had in the old days?
No, I say that for two reasons. I think the first is that, the speed and scope of an endorsement because of social media is going to race around. So here am I in Ireland talking to you in the Gulf about an endorsement made by someone in the United States. We're connected in that way where, when someone makes a statement who happens to be a celebrity, we instantaneously pick up on it. But I say it for a second reason that's not as considered as often in the media. And that is that this election is not just being fought out through traditional media and it's not being fought out through the set piece interviews with a CNN or with a Fox or, with an MSNBC. Perhaps the most influential programs that Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are going on in the last weeks of this election are podcasts run by people who have celebrity status. They've built up that following. So the number 2 podcast in the United States is Call Her Daddy by a person named Alex Cooper. And Kamala Harris went there to talk about women's rights and reproductive rights and got a huge audience about that. The number 1 podcast in the United States is Joe Rogan, the former Ultimate Fighting championship figure who has turned that to promote right-wing conservative causes. And guess where Donald Trump's going to show up in the next week? He's going to be on that podcast in part because of Rogan's celebrity status.
There's another type of celebrity on the campaign trail, and that is former U.S. presidents. There are still quite a few former presidents alive, Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, Joe Biden. There is, of course, George W. Bush as well. Fair to say that none of them have they come out and supported, well, not surprisingly from the Democrats, but George W. Bush, for example, hasn't come out to support Donald Trump, has he?
And he won't, because George W. Bush, like I'd say the large majority of people who have been in Republican politics up to the Trump era, don't approve of what Trump is doing. Bush has kept his counsel specifically on what he thinks about Trump, but he has appeared with the other former presidents in support of the U.S. system, in sort of that pointed idea of, look, the system is bigger than the man. But I think what is even more significant are those people in Trump's cabinet in his first term and in his White House who not only are not endorsing him, they actually now are saying he is a threat. And I think the headline in the past 24 hours is that you have a former chief of staff, White House chief of staff, John Kelly, who says that Donald Trump fits the general definition of a fascist. You have the former head of the American military, General Mark Milley, who has used the word fascist to refer to Trump. And I think that's something that's one of the variables in this election are going to be the number of Republican figures, senior Republican figures, who not only withhold their endorsement for Donald Trump, but who actually say to Republican voters, if you vote for this man, you are risking Republican values. You're risking American values by doing so.
You mentioned how Taylor Swift had managed to mobilize a lot of younger voters in the United States. And I just wondered whether voter apathy amongst younger voters was an issue. Is that something of concern, do you think, with regards to, let's say, the Gen Z voters?
Well, historically, the 18 to 30 or 18 to 35 group have had a lower participation rate. The greatest participation rate in U.S. elections are those over 65. Now, what happened in 2020 in the pandemic election is that you saw a rise in participation by everyone. The key, what's going to decide this election? You can just put the polls aside for a moment because it's a toss-up election. What's going to decide this is turnout. It's going to be whether the Democrats or the Trumpists turn out more of their people. And clearly, because the 18 to 35 group have had a lower participation rate in the past, you've got more potential there if you can get them mobilized, if you can get them out there. And I think what we're seeing here is that Trump has an appeal to young men, but that Harris has an overwhelming advantage with young women. And I think the question will be, of those two groups, young men versus young women, who shows up on November 5th? Because that could be one of the variables that decides who gets into the White House.
Okay, well, we're out of time, and we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Professor of International Politics at University College Dublin's Clinton Institute, Scott Lucas. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
France has committed a $108 million aid package for Lebanon at an international conference hosted by the French President Emmanuel Macron. Well, President Macron emphasized the need for massive aid in light of the ongoing conflict between Hezbollah militants and Israel, which has displaced 1 million people, resulted in the deaths of more than 2,500 people, and exacerbated the country's economic crisis.
In the immediate term, massive aid must be provided to the Lebanese population, whether it is for the hundreds of thousands of people displaced by the war or the communities that are hosting them. The United Nations has launched an appeal for 426 million euros. France will provide 100 million euros at this conference. What is needed is simply to shelter families, feed children, care for the wounded, and continue to provide schooling for children. Solutions must be found quickly, because we must, at all costs, prevent the displacement of people from the south, Beirut, and other regions of Lebanon.
Well, organisers of the Paris conference, which was attended by more than 70 countries and international organisations, said they'd raised a total of $1 billion in humanitarian assistance. Germany announced a total of 96 million euros in humanitarian aid for both Lebanon and neighbouring Syria, which is also suffering from the escalating violence in the region. Additionally, Italy pledged $10.8 million in aid for Lebanon. Well, for more on this, I'm joined now by Lebanon's ambassador to the United Kingdom, Rami Mortada. Thank you so much for joining us once again here on Al Arabiya News, Ambassador. 70 nations taking part in that conference in Paris. A large number of countries have made large donations. Does Lebanon feel very loved at this stage by the rest of the world?
Well, definitely, it shows solidarity by the international community with Lebanon in these difficult circumstances. And it shows how much Israel is isolated in its blatant war against Lebanon. Those 70 participants have spoken loudly on the need for an immediate ceasefire and on the need for finding a diplomatic solution for this conflict.
France has pledged around $100 million US dollars to support Lebanon. That's a large sum of money, isn't it? And it's almost matched by Germany. Just tell us a bit about what that money's needed for.
Well, you know, the huge and acute humanitarian crisis that is being used by this Israeli war against Lebanon. So the need is much bigger. But however, we appreciate the pledges that were announced today, and I think they serve a very good humanitarian purpose that Lebanon is in bad need for.
Is it enough to make a significant difference, Ambassador?
We hope so. We hope so. It all depends on when the war will end. We hope that it will end immediately, because there is a diplomatic way out of this.
1 million people have been displaced within Lebanon. 2,500 people have sadly been killed. There's an economic crisis as well there in Lebanon. A lot of donor countries, though, will be worried that the money that they're pledging isn't going to reach the people that need it most. There are concerns about corruption. What would you say to people with concerns like that?
Well, we've already pledged that all the humanitarian assistance we're receiving will be channeled through the United Nations different agencies. So we have a safe channel for the reception of these aids.
Okay, now looks like $1 billion has been raised in total pledges. Just tell us a little bit more about the distribution of that aid. Will the Lebanese army play a role, do you think?
They will definitely play a role. We have an all-encompassing multi-departmental task force which is handling this, as I said, under the direct supervision of the United Nations, which is the main party which will oversee the distribution of this aid. And the need is huge, as you can imagine. For more than 2 months now, Israel has been escalating its war. Actually, the number of displaced is 1.4 million. a continuous carpet bombing of a whole country. So you can imagine the dire humanitarian situation, and targeting health facilities and hospitals and support aids. So this is a much needed aid, and subsequently also we will be needing assistance in the reconstruction of what has been destroyed, and it's massive.
Yeah, your Prime Minister, or the acting Prime Minister, Najib Mikati, said that, quote, immense human suffering, loss of lives in Lebanon has been inflicted and has inflicted severe damage on the country's infrastructure, economy and social fabric. And I just want to pick up on what you were just saying there. How long a recovery period might we be looking at here for Lebanon?
Well, you know that this war came to compound other crises that already Lebanon was facing, starting with the economic meltdown, then a political crisis, and now this war. So it's the perfect storm, as we refer to it. The losses, direct and indirect, are amount to more than $20 billion. So Lebanon is a country that has been playing a global public good now for more than a decade, hosting more than 1/3 of its population as refugees. So I think it deserves this attention and this international solidarity.
In terms of progress, Israel says it wants Hezbollah out of the south of Lebanon. Is that something that you think perhaps, with this Paris conference in mind, one of the aspects of the conference is to provide support to the Lebanese military so they can perhaps police the south of the country? Do you think this could be, therefore, the beginning of the end of the conflict?
Well, the end of the conflict is through the full and symmetrical implementation of Security Council Resolution 1701, which includes all the ingredients that address all concerns. However, in order for the implementation phase to start, there should be a ceasefire. I think naturally no detailed negotiations can start before there is a ceasefire, which is the utmost priority at this stage.
Your Prime Minister calling on the international community to take action, but we've seen some action there in Paris today in the form of around $1 billion worth of pledges. What has struck you in terms of the international response to this? And I just want to pick up on a visit to your country by the Italian Prime Minister at the end of last week. She seems to be taking quite a leading position in this situation. What's really impressed you in terms of the countries that have come to Lebanon's aid and the countries that are genuinely trying to lend a hand and broker a solution?
I think there is widespread solidarity with Lebanon, and the international community is appalled by the level of brutality and violence that Israel is inflicting on the Lebanese population. So they all trying to help. However, I think the much needed help is through securing an immediate ceasefire. And immediately after, a diplomatic track would address, as I said, all concerns. In parallel, of course, humanitarian aid is much needed. So it's a multi-track initiative. Actually, today the Paris conference addressed 3 parallel tracks, which is first the political and the need for a ceasefire, and to look for a diplomatic solution under the framework of Security Council Resolution 1701. The second track is the humanitarian, although also very much important. And the third one is support for state institutions, mainly the Lebanese armed forces, which will be called to play a major role in South Lebanon after the ceasefire. So I think this approach, this holistic approach is much needed. But as I said, the priority now is to stop the bloodshed and reach a ceasefire, because immediately after the ceasefire, we think that there is a diplomatic way out of this quagmire.
I mean, Israel, of course, wants Hezbollah to cease operating as a state within the state of Lebanon. There are probably quite a lot of Lebanese people who have that same desire, aren't there?
Well, of course, Hezbollah as a Lebanese party, some agree with it, some do not agree. But this is an internal Lebanese dynamic which will come subsequently. Now, as I said, the immediate priority is to stop the bloodshed and stop ceasefire. And Israel will not be able to force anything by coercion. By diplomatic approach, I think much can be achieved.
Tell us a bit about what you're hearing with regards to the situation on the ground in Lebanon. What's been the latest in the last 24 hours, for example?
Continuous carpet bombing throughout the country, targeting hospitals and targeting support team and ambulances now. It's, if you want, the same toolkit that has been employed in Gaza that we're witnessing in Lebanon.
And clearly, becoming the next Gaza is something we've heard people in Lebanon expressing as a fear. But looking at what happened in Paris today, I mean, that doesn't look likely to happen, does it?
I hope so. I hope so. Today, I think the main takeaway from this gathering in Paris is that you have on one side the whole international community, and on the other side, Israel, which is very much isolated in its brutal war against Lebanon.
Thousands of people have obviously been displaced within Lebanon. Many others have gone abroad. Tens of thousands have gone across the border into Syria, and some of them may be of Syrian origin, but some of them apparently are not. And I'm just wondering what sort of a welcome, what sort of a situation awaits them when they get across the border into Syria?
Well, obviously they're fleeing for their lives because Israel is also targeting all the crossings towards Syria. It's a very dire situation, as you can imagine. Again, there is a need for an immediate ceasefire, and that the voices of reason, whether in the region or beyond, must be heard. We have a warmongering Israeli government that has chosen the path of war and of coercion. I think this trend should be reversed to the benefit of peace and to the benefit of the civilian populations, which, after all, are the ones suffering the most.
And were Lebanon to have better functioning institutions, in particular in the world of politics, and have, for example, the apparatus of a normal functioning state, like a head of state, do you think a lot of this could have been averted? And what steps is Lebanon taking to fill the power vacuum and ensure that the country does have a head of state who can represent Lebanon internationally?
That's also an utmost priority, but not to be confused with the ongoing war that is left subsequently for the Lebanese different political blocs to come together, take stock of the difficult situation the country is facing, and elect a president, which is also an utmost priority.
But can't that happen whilst the country is in the current situation? Isn't that something that Lebanon can be working on right now?
It can happen anytime. Actually, there is no link between the two tracks. However, you know that we've been 2 years now facing this deadlock. I hope that soon we will be able to overcome it. But this is not in any way a link to the war. It's a totally dissociated track, which, as I said, also is an utmost priority.
And just lastly, Ambassador, looking forwards to the day when the violence has stopped. I mean, clearly Lebanon is going to be dependent on aid for a very long time, isn't it, before it can get up and running? When do you see Lebanon, were the war to end tomorrow, being in a position where it can start to stand on its own 2 feet again?
Well, you know, Lebanon is a very resilient country. It has always managed to surprise the world with its quick recovery. However, definitely we will need international assistance As I said, we were always victimized by regional conflicts. So it's time for Lebanon to recover, and we're looking for a long-term arrangement that will put us on a path to recovery and hopefully to prosperity. But you are right, we will need international assistance to accompany us through this very difficult track.
Okay, well, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us. Lebanon's ambassador to the United Kingdom, Rami Mortala, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
To Russia now, where the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has met with President Vladimir Putin for the first time in over 2 years. The meeting comes on the final day of the BRICS summit as the Russian president faces calls from his BRICS allies to end the conflict in Ukraine. Well, Ukraine's foreign ministry has condemned the visit in recent days following the UN Secretary's decision not to attend Ukraine's peace summit back in June. Well, Ukraine's foreign ministry said that Russia failed to win support for its invasion at the BRICS summit, where President Putin faced direct calls for the conflict to end from some of his closest and most important partners. Well, in a statement, the ministry said the BRICS summit, which Russia planned to use to split the world, has once again demonstrated the world majority remains on the side of Ukraine in its quest to guarantee a comprehensive, just and sustainable peace. Over more, we can cross to the UK and speak to Lord David Owen, the former British Foreign Secretary. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, sir. At that BRICS summit in Russia, we've heard China saying no further escalation in Ukraine, Brazil saying it's time to start negotiations, India saying we want peace, not war in Ukraine. Do you think in some respects this whole conference has backfired on President Putin?
No, I think the Ukrainian situation, if anything, is going in President Putin's direction. So this has fundamentally got to be decided by the people in Ukraine. And I think they should focus on improving their military position prior to negotiations.
So you don't think that what came out of the BRICS conference, those world leaders appearing to put pressure on the Russian president, will make any difference at all?
We're not fighting this war. We've never fought this war. NATO said that they would try and help Ukraine with weapons supply because they were so behind. And that was what we were trying to do, was to help them as friends. We're not fighting a war. The Ukrainian government has got to fight the war and decide what they want to do. And any obvious issue is be strong militarily before you enter into negotiations, particularly with Russia.
If Russia has got, in the weeks ahead, if they haven't already arrived, 3,000 North Korean troops coming onto the battlefield, do you think that puts them in a stronger position?
Well, let's see whether they are that number and where they're positioned and how quickly they come into any fighting position. A lot of this is propaganda war going on, and we've got to remember this, as far as I'm speaking as a country that's a member of NATO. This is not our battle. This is a battle between the Ukrainians and the Russians, and they have to stand on their own feet as far as they can and do as well as they can in the fight before negotiations start, and even while negotiations continue.
And yet, many Western nations have tried to isolate Russia and punish Russia for that invasion of Ukraine. And we saw more than 20 world leaders turning up there in Kazan to attend the BRICS summit. Something of a coup for President Putin, then, perhaps, and a message that he doesn't need the West. He can live very well without them.
Well, President Putin is able to command and influence quite a substantial number of countries in the area. shouldn't surprise us, therefore, very much, whether he can pull them together. And it was in his interest to have a display that he was still influential, particularly with China. This North Korean relationship that they're seemingly now putting in, initially when there was talk of getting weapons from North Korea, China didn't seem too happy about it. It looks as if Russia has persuaded China that they should play the Korean card militarily to the full. That's with troops and arms. And it's a pretty far-reaching decision that they're making. They've got to watch their step. South Korea is sitting there extremely well-armed and extremely well-governed and ready to stand up against North Korea if they start playing silly games. And Japan will help them too, and America and others. So they're playing in a tricky area, and let's watch. We haven't got much influence on it. Anyone in Europe hasn't. And with the American inauguration not coming until January the 20th, they're not going to get the Biden administration taking a very big position, and you're not going to get a change in American policy, therefore, for quite a while.
One of the popular Russian television hosts, Yevgeny Popov, who hosts a political show on Russia 1, said that the BRICS summit there in Kazan showed a failure to isolate Moscow. He said the West, the US, Washington, Brussels, London ended up isolating themselves. What do you think he's getting at here?
I think that's rather simplistic. It's a difficult position for the West in the sense America's in the middle of a presidential election, and we don't know who's going to win. If the Vice President, Kamala Harris, wins, then she will be in a strong position, and circumstances will change. If, by some chance, Trump wins, obviously the Western position is going to be weaker, and Russia will probably wait until he takes office. Anyhow, not much can be done in terms of America between now and Inauguration Day. Biden stays in charge during that period, and America will not allow any major strategic decisions to be taken. They'll just hold the situation.
So what you're saying is that it's important that between now and January, in the event that there is a second Trump administration, that Ukraine has made as much progress on the battlefield as possible so that if negotiations are forced upon Ukraine, they're in a stronger position. Does that sort of roughly sum up your thinking here?
Yes. Realpolitik, that's what influences events. If you're going into negotiations, you do your utmost to be in a stronger position militarily and in terms of land which you control as you can. And Ukraine should focus on that issue and not trying to second guess when or when not there are negotiations. Ukraine has shown themselves ready for a negotiation. Therefore, they're obviously ready to give up some measure of their land. I don't think they've yet convinced a lot of their own people what land should be given up and how much. They have to have those own private discussions and get a consensus in the country themselves. But we all know the areas of controversy, Crimea, Donetsk, but recently people have been firing into the other area where they have a port, Odessa. Now, giving up Crimea is not such a serious situation as long as you're sure you've got Odessa. We've also got to remember Russia's a massive country, but it didn't have an outlet that it controlled into the Black Sea. Therefore, there's some logic in the fact that Crimea will eventually come to Russia, but not at the expense of Odessa and Ukraine having access to the Western world, and not more than that. I mean, they're very big grain exporters. The world is hugely dependent, actually, on Ukraine food, grain. And Therefore, we all watch this with certain apprehension because the world balance in terms of food is not, totally uninfluenced by Ukraine. It's a big agricultural producer.
What is your understanding of the situation on the ground in Ukraine? I mean, we hear varying reports. We've heard, obviously, about Ukrainian incursions into Russian territory. What is your understanding at the moment as to what kind of a position Ukraine is in? Were negotiations to be held tomorrow? Would Ukraine be going into those negotiations in a position of strength or weakness?
I prefer not to get involved in that question because to answer it may in some way weaken or seek to influence Ukraine. Ukraine has got to make those decisions themselves. They've got to fight to get into a good position, both militarily and politically. And that's their responsibility. We've got to stop this business of trying to run Ukrainian policy. We're generally supportive of Ukraine. We are not fighting in Ukraine or for Ukraine. We are trying to ensure that they have enough weapons to stand up against Russian invasion. Twice Russia have invaded. Russia ought to be judged in the world very badly for this behavior. At the moment, if we go on flapping on this issue, we will do no. Russia is in the wrong for invading Ukraine. End of story. We are helping Ukraine fight by trying to get enough weapons to them, but we are not fighting, nor are we politically in control of Ukraine. And we oughtn't to spend our time telling them what to do in the negotiations. It only weakens their position.
Going back to the BRICS conference in Kazan, the Ukrainians are not happy and have expressed as much about the presence of the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres being there in Kazan. Do you think he was right to attend, though?
It's a very difficult position to be the UN Secretary General. You have to serve the whole world, and he has to take into account that Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council, and he basically can't operate effectively unless the veto powers on the Security Council, the 5 countries, are prepared to give him room for maneuver. And therefore, he owes a responsibility to all the members, and particularly the permanent 5. And from time to time, Secretary Generals of the UN take actions which are not always liked by America, Britain, and France. That's inevitable. So I stand in a position. We've got a good Secretary General. Let him make those judgments, and from time to time, he will upset those of us like Britain, France, and America. It's inevitable. And best shut your mouth and let him get on with his job. His job is to make the UN Security Council work. That's bloody difficult. And he's got to take account of Russia.
Indeed, he has a tough job on his hands, a very unenviable one as well. Listening to some of the other comments that were made there in Kazan, President Putin talking about the situation in the Middle East. And one of the things he said that stood out was that unless the Palestinians get their own state, they would feel the burden of historical injustice right across the region. That's likely to chime, isn't it, with a lot of people here in the Middle East. And I'm just wondering whether you think this symbolizes perhaps the beginning or the continuing loss of Western influence in this region, the Middle East.
Well, Netanyahu isn't going to agree to a 2-state solution. You can talk about it as much as you like. He isn't going to do it. And at the moment, he has won substantial power by a very successful use of Israeli forces. That's the reality. You can talk about it in any way you like, but that's the reality. And I think best let a solution come from the participants. And the best thing that has happened has been the Abraham Accords, where Israel has got into a dialogue with the Muslim Arab countries around the region. And why did Hamas move into Israel. It was to disrupt the Abraham Accord discussions, return to the Abraham Accord discussions, return to fundamentals, and the parties that are immediately involved in the dispute trying to reach a long-term settlement for Israel's position in the Middle East. And there is a solution. It will take time, and it needs to be pursued now, not held up by what may or may not happen in Gaza, or what may or may not be happening in the Lebanon. Or, big question, is Israel going to attack Iran? Iran has bombed in Israel. Israel is scheduled to reply. In my view, it is not inevitable that Israel does reply. And I'm sure the Americans are calling this into question in private discussions. Is it wise? Of course, they have the right to reply, having been attacked, but is it wise to reply? And at the moment, Israel's won most of its battles, and it's in a strong position. It doesn't need to attack Iran, and I think probably it would be wiser not to. What America has done is close the gap in Israeli defenses and supplied some more sophisticated anti-missile defense in and around Israel, so that they can ensure that another Iranian attack is even less successful than the last one. It wasn't very successful, but they did get a couple of missiles through.
Iran, you just mentioned there, is one of the countries that's represented in Kazan at the BRICS summit. And BRICS is a growing club of nations. There seems to be a queue of countries wanting to join BRICS. How powerful and how influential a group do you see the BRICS nations as becoming?
India was there. Why was India there? Because they're having trouble with China on its border. And it was interesting for them to go there and make probably some progress in terms of China's relationship with India. It doesn't change India's basic position. It seems to me everybody looks at attendance on these groupings, well, what they can get out of it. And that's quite reasonable. And it's not unforeseen or impossible. And the Russians have shown they can do it, to convene groupings of nations. I mean, India has traditionally relied on Russian arms for decades to defend themselves, particularly against China. They're not going to say cheerio to Russia. And then South Africa. So we all think that we made huge help, and Mandela got out of prison, and black South Africa is becoming a democratic country, and blacks and apartheid all over. But who supported them when apartheid went on over all these years? Russia. And so people get some of this stuff out of kilter. I mean, when South Africa was celebrating Mandela, praised Russia, went to Russia. And we all knew very well that Russia had been very helpful to them, possibly more than we were. So people who are fighting for their freedom get their help from any countries that will come along and help. And if they're wise, they remember the people who did help them, and they show continued friendship, because they may need their help again in the future. I think you're drawing too much surprise, almost, that Russia has been able to convene that type of meeting. Russia has been able to do that for quite a while. Russia plays a pretty clever diplomatic hand. I've seen that at close quarters in the Balkans, for example, but in many other parts of the world, I've watched how Russia's diplomacy is a skilled one. Lavrov, their foreign secretary equivalent, is a very able, clever man. He's been around a long time. He's made many friendships, and he's influential.
This is my last question, Lord Owen. A piece in the New York Times sort of summarized this summit in Kazan, saying that not much was achieved, but the optics were powerful. Would you agree with that?
Yes, very good assessment. But we have to watch it, and we must understand that diplomacy requires hard work, a sympathy and understanding of people's position, even when you don't agree with them, and building up friends so that at some of these meetings, you're not on your own. Russia's doing exactly the same. They're using the same diplomatic skills as we've developed over the years. And if they look very effective in doing that, as they do at the moment, we shouldn't be surprised.
Okay, well, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us, former British Foreign Secretary Lord David Owen. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thanks for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.
News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Al Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
Welcome to the show. I'm Riz Khan. The annual cost of cybercrime is expected to reach $10 trillion next year. To put that figure into context, in terms of GDP, it would be the third biggest economy in the world after the US and China. That's why countries from Australia to China, the UK and US are racing to tighten up their cybersecurity laws. And it's why the UN is expected to pass a landmark cyber treaty in the coming weeks. From deepfakes and disinformation to hacks and attacks on infrastructure, healthcare and security networks, cybercrime is becoming the #1 challenge for law enforcement and intelligence agencies. And artificial intelligence is already changing the rules of the game. Now, our increasingly connected digital world makes us all more vulnerable to criminal gangs and state-sponsored hackers who can access our data and devices. Imagine them taking control of your bank account, your electrical vehicle, and even your pacemaker. Interpol is the world's largest police force. Formed in the aftermath of the First World War, it was established to combat an increasing threat from international crime. Collaboration between countries allowed crime fighting to extend beyond national boundaries. And today, the organization has almost 200 member countries. When it comes to fighting cybercrime, that original principle of collaboration is more important than ever. I met with Dr. Neil Jaton, Interpol's Director of Cybercrime, for an insight into the agency's battle against the hackers. Dr. Jaton, great to have some time with you.
Thanks for having me.
Now, you know, there's this romantic image of what Interpol is. It's like that kind of agents in coffee shops in romantic places like Rome and Paris having secret meetings. It's like the CIA, MI6, I guess. How real is that?
It's spot on. It's exactly like that. It's not really like that. But I don't know what a lot of agencies, you have this romantic feeling for it, and then about what you think in your head, what it's going to be, and then you come in to an agency. So I've been here for 2 months, and I didn't really have too many preconceived notions because I've been a federal agent for a long time. So I've kind of been in this space. But I will say that it has been an amazing experience just for the 2 months, and I think the strength of Interpol and the strength of my team within the Cybercrime Directorate is having, there's only roughly 40 to 50 people. There are only 2 Americans, so you're looking at a wide array of cultures and people and bringing all sorts of strengths from their walks of life.
Tell me what your son said when you said you're joining Interpol.
Yeah. Well, my son was very excited. We were actually watching an action movie at that time when we were, so I was living in D.C., and he was like, oh, like that, like James Bond. And I said, no, not exactly. And I explained kind of what I was doing, and he was less than impressed with me. But he was also kind of aware of the romantic notions of, being a federal agent and how that is. And he was like, yeah, you're still just dad,
And I guess the cybercrime area on which you focus, you head, is even more that kind of ethereal area.
I mean, it's so emerging and evolving. It is very, very tough. And I don't think when you come into law enforcement, I don't think most people, maybe nowadays, but when I came in 15 years ago, it wasn't to do cyber crimes or crimes, involving computers. You wanted to knock down doors. You wanted to put people behind, bars. You wanted to really be high speed. And I think nowadays the crime, you can almost just get rid of the word cyber and just call it crime, because there's not a lot of crime that's really not connected now to a computer, to a phone, or some other network system. You really see that. So I do think that as you progress through your career, you may have come in saying, I want to combat this type of crime, but it's very clear that you're going to have some sort of cyber background to be successful.
And yet the Hollywood image is that cyber criminals have the chance to take down entire systems. Airports can be shut down, traffic lights can be changed, right. Like the Die Hard 4 kind of thing. Any reality in that?
I think everything's kind of based a little bit in reality, and then movies are, amplified to, a much higher magnitude. But can bad guys target critical infrastructure and be successful? Sure. You looked at the Colonial Pipeline incident in 2021, the U.S.'s largest fuel pipeline, and what the bad guys were able to do was go through the billing system. And you would think that something maybe as innocuous as that wouldn't have such detrimental effects, but it did. The Colonial Pipeline had to shut down the entire company to contain the breach. Large lines at the pump, concern about fuel availability. So it is a reality, but it's not all doom and gloom. I will say that every day we have these sort of conferences where we come together, where we talk about how do we improve cybersecurity. So I think we're making great strides.
How did you react when the CrowdStrike incident happened? It was faulty software, so it wasn't really malicious, but I think it exposed a lot of vulnerabilities.
So for us, we are not in the critical infrastructure cybersecurity vulnerability business necessarily. We're in the law enforcement business. For any sort of incident, whether it's a CrowdStrike, that wasn't quite, malicious, through something that is, we really are dependent on the member countries' law enforcement to reach out to us for assistance. Or in some cases, maybe we'll have some intelligence through some partners that we're able to push out.
The interesting thing about that incident, though, was that it opened the door for criminals to bounce in quickly.
That's right. They're always looking. And so, again, I think you have all these national security agencies working diligently trying to identify these vulnerabilities to make it much more difficult for hackers.
It does suggest, though, that the fact they can react quickly to what was not a malicious attack and get their malicious attack in, that they're quite ahead of the game.
I do think it's a little bit of a cat and mouse game. I think that the incentive for the bad guys is financial, so that when you are really focused on making a buck, this is how you earn your living. Of course, you're going to be very, very aggressive in identifying these threats. But I will say that law enforcement, Interpol, is forward-looking, looking at emerging technology, looking at the emerging threats, and trying and try to stay right with the criminals.
As director of cybercrime at Interpol, of course, you get to see the extremes, how bad things could be.
Right.
How worried should we be as citizens?
No, I think you should be concerned. Obviously with emerging technology, but AI, quantum computing, those are obviously some issues. But just as being a parent of a child who I'm finally allowing to have a smartphone for the first time as a teenager, we have had to have sit-down conversations with them about the threats. And I'm like, your dad is the director, cybercrime director at Interpol. You cannot be doing these things. You cannot have this app. You're too young. But I'll just say that I think schools are doing a much better job of understanding the issues as well. Parents should take some responsibility, on themselves too.
For many of us, Hollywood is that lens, and cybercrime is seen as young people, sometimes in basements. They're doing things that, from their homes, effectively.
Right, in their basements behind their keyboard.
Is it real?
Yeah, I'm assuming, that is quite a bit. I mean, but also it runs the gamut. You may think like, oh, it's a 50-year-old grizzled, person just down in the basement. But no, as you see in some of these ransomware incidents, they're youth. They're not even of legal age, and they're causing this sort of mayhem. So yeah, it's just somebody being able to the ability to have that tech savviness and also the will to actually cause harm. We've seen criminals all ages.
Beyond these, institutions and documents that come out through the UN and so forth, in general, how well is the world keeping up with the threat of cybersecurity, on cybersecurity?
I think well. I mean, obviously, we're always going to. It's really, I think, country dependent. As Interpol, my goal is to bring up those that maybe not as cyber mature, to bring them up to a level so that they can defend themselves, defend their citizens. I do think it's improving.
And then you do need legislation, because one of the biggest frustrations in traditional crime is legal loopholes or the lack of legal infrastructure to be able to lock the bad guys away.
Yeah, so, I mean, again, Interpol is not here to tell a country what to do and how to legislate itself, but we do understand that the legality, the laws have to match the emerging crimes, and, in the U.S., they're having the same issue. So that's really not something that we would directly say, person to person. What I would say, though, from any perspective, what I will say, and I'm not saying that government should make it mandatory, but if you are a victim of cybercrime, whether it's anything from being a business being attacked by ransomware, or a child who's a victim of sexual exploitation, is to contact law enforcement. I know that sometimes it can be very, very difficult to make that, because you're now suffering through the worst day of your life, and now you have to go talk to law enforcement about it. But if you really want to make receive some justice and then help future victims, it is to reach out to law enforcement.
Now, I know you don't tell governments how to legislate and so on, but I do wonder how much it impedes what you can do when it actually comes to enforcing what you're doing.
So for us, our enforcement is only through our member countries' law enforcement agencies. So it's really upon them. We'll provide them as much information, as much support as we can, and then it's on their individual governments what they do at the end of their legislation.
How, again, going to this idea that hackers can create widespread havoc, how much is this kind of DDoS, a term that's come into our vocabulary now, distributed denial of service, how much of a threat is that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously you see, so DDoS attacks, that's the slang for it, but
DDoS,
yeah, that's okay. So obviously it is a significant avenue of attack. But we, again, if a company or if a business or an entity is suffering from a DDoS attack or any sort of cyber attack, my point of view, and I think you would talk to anybody from law enforcement, is reach out to your local law enforcement, have them, and if they need support, then come to Interpol and Cybercrime Directorate, and we'll do more than anything that we can, we'll do anything that we can help.
Dr. Chetan, what is the biggest challenge that you're facing right now? What eats up your time and resources?
Well, I would always say that funding and finding personnel. Interpol, we bring in seconded officers. So basically, like myself, I come from the U.S. My home agency pays for me. I am on loan to Interpol for a few years. So it's getting those agencies from all different countries. And we want a wide spectrum. I would have like somebody from every region to come in and be a part of our team. So it's finding, the personnel, it's finding the funding for the different projects that we have. Those are the things that really take a lot of my time.
I guess the great thing about being such a diverse group of people at Interpol is that you do take back these skill sets with you and share them.
Yeah, that's the selling point. Like, we want your best and your brightest. You come to us because I know it's also a sort of a catch-22 when you send somebody who's so good. Now they're not with you anymore in your home agency. So I understand that. But my hope is that when you come to us, when you leave in the 3 years, whether sometimes they're short-term secondments for a year, sometimes they're 3 years or extended, my hope is that when you go back, you use the skills that you develop, especially like the diplomacy skills, the ability to mediate, those sort of skills that you may not get as a police officer, as an agent. You take those skills back and enhance your agency.
You explained how this isn't really what you got into. You weren't really going into cybercrime, but of course everything's evolved and it's continually evolving. So is AI, artificial intelligence, your friend or enemy, for example?
No. I think any emerging technology, I'll just say, in my opinion, it's neutral. So it's whoever it's in the hands of, whatever the intent is, that's really whether it's good or bad. And so we understand the criminality, the uses of it, and criminals are always going to take advantage, whether it's AI, quantum computing. I mean, it was computers, 20 years ago, and smartphones and apps and all that. Whatever emerging crime, there's going to be some ingenious criminal who's going to try to find it and exploit it. So again, it's on us as law enforcement to be forward-looking, to say, hey, these are the emerging threats, and how can we combat that? And so within Interpol, we do have an innovation center that's also housed with Singapore that's looking at those very concerns.
This sounds like an echo of guns don't kill people,
yeah,
people kill
it's
people.
the same. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to compare
of course,
one to the other, but again, it really is how you use it, because I think there's going to be some great uses with AI, obviously, and then obviously it's going to be some negatives.
I think the way I've heard you put it is that basically technology is agnostic.
That's right. Yeah. That's how I feel.
In terms of keeping up with everything, do you have the resources to be able to keep up?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, obviously, could we always use more funding? Could we always use more personnel? Of course. I mean, anybody, any agency could. But what we should do, and I think in Cybercrime Director, is we should be more forward leaning and continue sustained communications with our 196 member countries to actually ask them, what do you need? Because we may think from Singapore, these are the cyber concerns that we think you should be concerned about, and yet it may not be. So that's part of my strategy, is to conduct outreach with those members to say, what exactly do you need from Interpol?
How do you regard the term cyber psychology, and how does that fit in with what you do?
For me, from a law enforcement perspective, what I want to always look at is when we go and interview a victim, whether the victim is a business, a hospital, and have to talk to the CISO who's now suffering through stress, and I'm not comparing them, or to talk to somebody who's been a victim of some sort of sexual exploitation, especially with children, is to understand that is their worst day. And so for law enforcement, I think our goal is always to get the evidence, to get the interview, and then go on and catch the bad guy and stop the next thing from happening. But I think from law enforcement, we have to take a step back and realize that these are some bad days, the worst days that these people are suffering through, to show them some grace, show them some kindness at the same time.
Technology is moving fast, but let me wrap up by asking you if you could paint me a picture of what the cybercrime scene might look like maybe a decade from now.
So, I mean, I wish I had a magic ball and I knew who to invest in, which companies were going to be a part. But obviously AI, I mean, that's the buzzword, AI. I think quantum, computing and the encryption that's going to, become problematic in the future. I think those are things that I'm sure criminals are already salivating at the thought of. I think that there are the law enforcement and other government agencies that are also looking at that and saying, no, we're going to be ready for this. We're going to, maybe not everything, but we're actually, the focus isn't just going to be on for the criminals. We're actually going to concentrate on these things too. So I will just say, though, that Interpol has been in existence. We just celebrated our 100th anniversary last year. So 1923 to 2023. And so in 10 years, I think the Interpol and Interpol's Cybercrime Director will still be combating, transnational cybercrime, and still being a good partner to 196 member countries.
Dr. Neil Jaton, thank you very much. Good luck with your work.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
At Al Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life,